It was early spring and a rainy day when the villain Gabriella was dying quietly lying on the wet ground. Unfortunately, some consequences led to her inevitable death. She heard someone's voice looking up. She saw a man. He did not understand why everything happened this way. Looking at her, he said that he wanted her to live even if they were not together. He looked at her intently and slowly raised her in a trembling voice. He said that for this reason he pretended not to know anything. Looking at Gabriella, he burst into tears. He did not understand why she was leaving him now. Gabriella looked at the young man and realized that if it were sunny, his face would not seem so sad. Ernst Castle Eckes, he who ruled the forces of the night, the leader who directed his faithful mighty army. He was also the husband of a holy villain, Gabriella. It all started with a contract. Novella March. His name is the true saint in which the young lady was in the body of a villain, Gabriella. As soon as she realized this, she began desperately trying to remember the plot. The Count had an illegitimate daughter, Gabriella, and she lived like an angel. But in the real story, on the contrary, she only accused and tormented and in the end faced death. The young lady was furious. She did not want such an end for herself at all, as she really wanted to live. The young lady read the novel before her rebirth. After the rebirth, an ad from the author suddenly popped into her head. The author wanted to write a story about a fictitious marriage with a cold man from the North Sea. She thought it would be nice to be the main character, but still wondered if she could be happy in the body of a villain. The young man looked intently at his wife and called her. A moment later, a knight approached them and said that they had caught the escaped coachman. The knight said that the coachman admitted that he had damaged the carriage wheel. The knight said that the coachman had a banner of the day's strength on his back. The young lady stared at them, breathing heavily. The knight said that it seemed that the first prince was behind all this. The young man furiously told the knight to cut off the coachman's hand. The coachman was shocked, as he did not expect to hear something like this. Ernst Castle said that they needed to find who was behind this. He looked at those present with fury and said that then the one who did this would have to cut off both legs and make him crawl for the rest of his life. The young lady looked at her husband intently. It was the first time she had seen him so frightening. Before they entered into a sham marriage, they signed a contract with several conditions. One of the conditions was that they were not allowed to fall in love. She looked at him intently because throughout their life together, she had been afraid of accidentally revealing her feelings and had experienced a lot. For all the years they had lived together, she wanted him to no longer bend his knees to the royal family, but she could not think that he would simply die like that. At the moment of the inevitable, she still managed to keep the family heirloom that he gave her as a wedding gift. She wanted to protect the family's valuable fire-resistant treasure by any means necessary. She knew she simply couldn't allow such a valuable artifact to fall into the hands of the royal family. She looked intently at her husband as if she wanted to tell him something, but he, in turn, told her that she needed to remain silent. She looked at him intently and said in a trembling voice that she had a ring. He said with tears in his eyes that her whole body was burning and she should take care of her health. She was very sorry that she had to leave him with such terrible memories, but she thanked him for not letting her die alone. But she in turn really hoped that they would be able to meet in the next life. The man looked at the young lady intently and asked her in confusion if she was listening to him. She froze in surprise. The young lady was in shock as she knew she was supposed to die in an accident. She looked intently at the young people who were in front of her because she did not understand what was happening because she knew that she was dead. She didn't understand why the forces of day and night had gathered in one place. She was shocked and wondered what had happened. The man said that today they are concluding a marriage between the Duke and the princess will leave for the north in 3 days. Now she realized that the conversation was about her husband and the princess unknown to her. She was in shock and did not understand what was happening at all. She was confused as if someone was tearing her heart apart. Memories suddenly came flooding back to her. She saw people insulting her and saying that she was a disgrace to the royal family. They all said that Princess Fiona was a blot on the rays of the noble sun. The young lady was shocked as she could not believe that she had become Princess Fiona. The man looked at everyone present and said that if no one had a return, then they could start signing. A moment later, the priest told the Duke and Princess to sign the contract. The princess looked at the Duke. She was puzzled by his appearance. She saw that his face became even gloomier, and he seemed completely cold to her. The young lady looked intently at the Duke, who in turn sat silently as he wanted to sign the contract. A moment later their eyes met and she froze in embarrassment. The priest looked at the princess intently and told her to hurry up. She froze as she saw the wedding vows. A moment later, she noticed the date on the document and froze in place. She realized that it had already been 6 years since Gabriella's death. Today was exactly 6 years since her death. She looked at the Duke as she understood that she had become his wife again. In turn, she was puzzled because he hated her, because she was the king's daughter. She stared at him, wondering if she should tell him that she was really Gabriella. She remembered that before her death she had begged the heavens to meet him again, and now she realized that her wish had come true. She tried to say something, but nothing came out. She decided to write, but all attempts were in vain. She was in shock and wondered how she could give him some kind of sign. She wondered if she would have to live in the body of a princess now. The kingdom was for a long time divided between two forces. They represented the wealthy South, loyal to the royal family. The forces of the day loved art, culture, and horse riding. The forces of the night also adored art, culture, and horsemanship, and were widespread throughout the desert north. They were united and acted according to the orders of the Grand Duke. They had completely different lifestyles, culture, and religion. She looked closely at the dress she would be wearing for the next 3 days after leaving the palace. She was surprised that the king suddenly insisted on uniting the two forces, but she knew it was actually a good deal. She was glad to see her husband after a long separation, but his expression was terribly cold. She understood that he was not happy with this marriage. She understood that he should have already forgotten his ex-wife. She wondered if he would remember her forever. She told herself that now was not the time to be sad. She knew that he was cold towards the princess because of her. She knew that he simply hated the royal family since childhood, so the cold gaze and gloomy expression were definitely not because of her. She understood that even if he didn't want this marriage, she was glad that they met again. She thought that most likely she was just being selfish. She hoped that he ate very well without her, since before due to work, he often forgot about food. A moment later, a maid burst into the room and told the lady that she had come to see her. The young lady froze in place and stared at the maid. The maid told the lady to stand up straight, as she had lost so much weight that she would have to have her waist measured again. The young lady was shocked and wondered how the maid dared to talk to her like that. Thanks to her body memory, she was aware of Lady Fiona's condition from birth. Even the maids had bullied her. She knew that she was a princess who had been ignored since childhood. Her consciousness began to move into the princess's body a week ago. And after a while it penetrated him completely. Although the body was in bed all this time, no one worried about the princess since she was a disgrace. She knew that the rumors were first started by one of the brothers who claimed the throne. She thought that the princess managed to survive only because no one was interested in her. The young lady understood that if she wanted to survive, she had to play the role of a fool. She understood that she had to be careful. She asked the maid with a grin why she was worried about the dress and not her own life. The maid asked with bewilderment what was the matter. The young lady told the maid with a smile that she would die within an hour. The maid excitedly asked the princess what she was talking about. The princess said that the maid was very impudent, and the pearls represented a celebration in honor of the bride's birth, and she had replaced them. The princess looked at the maid and said that if this was revealed, death awaited her. The maid in turn was taken aback and looked at the princess in fear. The maid looked at the princess with puzzlement and said that she didn't even know whether he was real or not. The princess looked at the maid with a smile and told her to tie up her dresses so that she would become even more beautiful. The maid trembled with fear and, asking the princess for forgiveness, asked if she had told anyone. The princess said that she had not told the other maids anything, but she could tell the king that the pearls had somehow disappeared somewhere. The maid hurriedly shouted to the princess that this should not be done and that it was not her doing. The princess looked at the maid in surprise and asked if the other maids had done this. She understood that even if she ripped out the maid's tongue, she would not be able to blame anything on others since she was their accomplice. The princess said with a smile that she first needed to ask her brother what she looked like. The maid stopped the princess in a hurry. The princess looked closely at the maid and asked whom she should blame next. The maid was taken aback and shouted to the princess that she would certainly return the pearls, since there was still time. The princess was surprised, looked at her and asked how she knew they weren't sold yet. The maid hesitated, not knowing what to answer, while the young lady watched her and understood that she would be useful to her. The princess looked at her intently and told her to kneel down. The maid looked at the princess in surprise. The princess looked at her closely and said that she seemed to need help. The princess looked at her and said with a smile that she would tell her brother that she could get married without pearls. The princess asked the maid if she had helped the other maids and shared the pearls with them. She said that she would tell her brother everything. The maid in turn was very frightened and screamed that this was not so. A moment later, the maid fell to her knees and begged the princess for another chance. The princess looked closely at the maid and asked why her chin was raised so high. The maid bowed lower and said that she was very sorry as she was consumed by greed. She begged the princess to forgive her. The princess looked at the maid with a smile and said that she was sad for her, but she had to be faithful to her. The princess said that the maid had escorted her to Ernest. The maid was surprised, but the princess said that if she did not want to go, she would go to prison. She understood that the maid would have to choose between loyalty and imprisonment. The maid shouted to the princess that she would be faithful to her. The princess looked at her intently and asked her name. The maid timidly said that her name was Sonia. The young lady knew that now the sleepyhead would serve the princess. She in turn really wanted to make sure that everyone got what they deserved. A couple of days later, the young lady said goodbye to her brothers. First, Prince Tudwig Fryken. Isodium said his heart sank at the thought of his dear sister's departure. Tudwig smiled and told his sister not to worry, as the royal guard would escort her to the port. The young princess only smiled at her brother, but deep down she was puzzled by his words. The young ladies watched the royals closely. They were delighted with the prince. The princess in turn thanked her brother. She stared at him and wondered if anyone really thought he was handsome. She saw only greed on his face. She knew that he was a very greedy man who had a hand in everything in the world. He even tried to steal sacred relics from other families. She also knew that it was he who ordered to get rid of Gabriella. Now she understood that she needed to act like Fiona. She knew that she shouldn't give in to emotions and needed to think about the main goal, but unfortunately, she still had his consciousness of the Grand Duchess in her. The prince said that he felt sorry that he would not be able to accompany his sister to the very end, but he breathed a sigh of relief when he learned that the third prince would be going with her. He looked at the prince and princess and said with a grin that they were blood brother and sister. The young lady looked at her brother intently. She knew that he never loved her. She understood that he was forced to do this because he could not get a place in the royal palace. The prince looked closely at his sister and smiled and told her to be careful. He told her with a smile that she should not forget to send him messages. She looked at him with a smile and said that she would never forget her older brother. She accidentally started speaking in the third person. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she was just smart. The young lady was furious and did not understand what he was saying at all. The prince looked at her with a hard gaze and said that it would be wonderful if she always spoke in the third person. The young lady was trembling with fear as he pressed her shoulder very hard, but she still agreed. She knew that the princess's memories still remained in her body, and she understood that the prince had spread stupid rumors about her. She couldn't believe that she had to talk about herself in the third person in public, but she had to hold on. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she would like to thank him. The prince looked at his sister in surprise as he did not understand what she was talking about and what she wanted to thank him for. The young lady hugged her companion with lightning speed and said with a smile that she never thought she would marry such an attractive man. A moment later, she looked at her brother and asked with a smile if he liked her beautiful dress. She spun around, and the prince froze in place in shock. At the same time, everyone present began to whisper as they noticed that the pearls on the princess's dress were not real. They knew that real pearls shimmered in the light, and they were rumored to know that the prince had spent a fortune on the dress. The young ladies glanced sideways at the prince and wondered if he had decided to save money on the princess. Everyone knew they weren't even blood-related, and he pulled the wool over everyone's eyes by saying he was taking care of his sister. The young lady looked intently at her brother and his reaction. Seeing the reaction of everyone present, she understood that she was not the only one who felt ashamed now. She looked around carefully and did not notice the second prince, but she knew it was for the best. She knew that the previous owner of the body always trembled with fear when she saw the second prince. She looked at the Duke in surprise, as it seemed to her that he was looking at her intently, frowning. She wondered if he had realized his situation right away. The prince looked at the butler and said that he seemed to have asked to decorate the dress exclusively with pearls. The butler hesitated and said that he had checked them at least 5 times, and it seemed that they had been replaced already in the palace. The prince looked at the butler with fury, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The princess looked closely at her brother and asked with a smile if she could take the maid with her, as she liked her very much. The prince looked at her intently and said that he could give her as a wedding present. The prince came closer to his sister and grabbed her firmly by the shoulder. He said with a grin that she should be happy. He said that if her husband bothered her, she should send him a message. He squeezed her shoulder very hard, and it hurt. The Duke saw that the prince was putting too much pressure on his wife, so he pushed her away and blocked her with his body. The Duke looked at the prince closely and said that he would now take good care of his wife himself. The young lady in turn froze in place from shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Everyone was surprised as he dared to touch the prince. The Duke looked after the prince and said that they had a long journey ahead of them and said goodbye to him. She saw the Duke's behavior and he told everyone that he would treat her with respect. She was in shock, as her heart was about to jump out of her chest. She looked at the Duke intently, as she found it difficult to breathe. She thought that if she saw death, she would never see him again. And for the last couple of days, she was worried that it was just a mirage. She was in shock and could not even imagine that she would become his wife again. He looked at her in surprise and asked what happened. She was puzzled that he had no idea who she really was. He looked at the servant and said that it was time for them to go. She was surprised, as she knew that this was not the only carriage, but he decided to go with her. He offered her his hand, which was very kind of him. She knew that he had no reason to ride in the same carriage. She understood that it seemed like he just wanted to protect the weak princess and make sure she didn't fall into the prince's trap. She looked intently at the Duke because she understood that it was simply impossible not to love such a man. In turn, the young lady was very glad that she was finally free. She was glad to have left the castle and escaped the clutches of the first prince. She understood that she could now return to the lands that were dear to her heart. The young lady was very happy with her happiness and simply could not believe it. Every time she looked at herself in the mirror, she was surprised as if for the first time. She was puzzled as she could not get used to the new face. She saw beautiful cat eyes, rounded eyebrows that emphasized the keen gaze. She had smooth porcelain skin and rosy cheeks, emphasizing the youth of a 23-year-old girl. She understood that it was beautiful like early autumn days. The young lady sighed heavily as she realized that this was now her true face. She wondered if she could act innocent all the time. She knew Gabriella was a villain, so she acted like an evil and cunning woman, but now she had questions about who really killed her. She thought that the Duke had probably already found out everything. She thought it was quite possible that it was the first prince or the second. She didn't know if he was cunning enough to use such tactics. She knew that the first prince was trying to win the fight for the throne, and he was very interested in ancient treasures and artifacts. She understood that given the fact that his target was the gems, he probably planned to kill her. She was puzzled because she did not understand why she ended up in the future and not the past, and not her own body either. She thought she had to go back in time and use the knowledge of the future to reunite with her husband. She remembered how she had swallowed the ring back then. She wanted to find out about everything when she arrived at the duchy, and she also wondered where the princess herself was. She decided to throw all thoughts away, since the only thing that really mattered was that she was the Duke's wife again. As far as she understood from the meeting, the Duke obviously had not yet understood anything, and if he had understood, it did not change anything. Part of her really wanted to sit down next to him and talk, but she just couldn't say that she was Gabriella. She wanted to say something, but her throat was so sore that she couldn't utter a word. She looked intently at the Duke because she understood that he was very close to her, but unfortunately also far away. The rest, she looked out the window as the spring wind was cool. It seemed to her as if she had arrived in that day. Late on a cool day, she confessed her feelings to the Duke, but he did not respond. Then she thought that she shouldn't talk about it anymore. Unfortunately, there was only silence between them. Only he and their breathing in unison existed. She wanted to quickly get rid of the magical shackles and tell him that she had ended up in the body of a princess. She thought for a moment as she had heard somewhere about shackles. She was in shock and told herself that this simply could not be. She felt like she was reading about heavy shackles in the march in the name of a saint. The main character, Ingrid, was also struck by a spell. She knew she had a limited role in this world. The lady looked at her friend and asked what he was talking about. He said that her role was sent by God and every hero has his own purpose. If she fulfilled it within a certain time, the shackles would be removed. She wanted to know more details. He smiled and said it wasn't that hard and he could show me if needed. The young lady looked closely at the book that was about the characters. She looked at it closely and found information about the exclusion. He said that a long spiritual spell had been cast on her. She asked in surprise what he was talking about as she was confused. He looked at her intently and said that in order to remove the spell she had to play her part. She looked at the young man intently and with surprise and asked what he was talking about. The young man said he called it the Salpura dance. He looked at her intently and said that if she failed, the spell would not be lifted. The young lady was shocked because she did not expect to hear something like this. She looked intently at her acquaintance and asked when the mad god would remove the shackles. He sighed heavily and said that no one knows, but it will be soon. He asked with a smile if she would like to go with him as he wanted to enjoy the beautiful view. She understood that in order to free herself from the shackles that prevented her from telling everything she needed to play the princess for some time, she was Gabriella, a villain pretending to be a cutie, but the villain was on the verge of death. She thought that maybe that's why she ended up in the princess's body. The young lady understood that she could get through everything and would do what was required of her. She wanted to play a character, break free from the shackles, and tell everything. She sighed heavily as she missed her husband, friends, and comrades very much. She loved her husband very much, but she knew that this plot was necessary for this story. She knew there was nothing she could do about it. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that he had a couple of days' hike ahead of him. She looked at him in surprise, but a moment later he said that upon arrival at the palace, she would be assigned the East Wing. He said that she would live there with her maids. She wanted to say something to him, but she saw that he was very cold. She knew she wouldn't get it right the first time, and he had no need to be nice to her. She was surprised because he had not been so distant before. She saw that his gaze became deeper and more serious. He looked at her in surprise and asked if there was something wrong with his face. She stood there embarrassed, not knowing what to answer. But a moment later she said with a smile that everything was fine. She saw that he was very worried and didn't know what to tell her. A moment later she asked with a smile why her husband was so cold. He looked at her intently but said nothing. She knew that at this rate she would completely bury herself. The Duke looked closely at the princess and asked if she had done it on purpose. She thought for a moment, not understanding what he was talking about, but a moment later she understood what he was talking about. She asked with a smile if she shouldn't have done it. She couldn't tell him it was on purpose. She knew that he agreed to marry the princess because she was not the smartest girl. She knew that if there had been someone smarter in the princess's place, he would not have agreed to the alliance, because it could have harmed the North. She looked at him intently and said that the clothes were terribly uncomfortable. He looked puzzled and said that he had not thought of that, and asked if her dress was too tight. Ernst said that he could stop the carriage and call a maid. She said with a smile that she didn't want that, and moved closer to him. The young lady smiled and said that he himself could help loosen her corset. He looked at her sullenly, and with fury, the young lady expected a slightly different reaction. A moment later, he said he could just stop the carriage and tell the maid. For a moment, she even wanted this, and she thought that he might recognize her. But unfortunately, everything turned out completely differently. She knew he was blinded by rumors and hatred, and given what was happening, it was partly understandable. She understood that it was normal that he did not recognize her. She understood that he saw the princess that everyone despised so much. She knew that the east wing of the building was for annoying guests, a beautiful place, but located too far from the main building. Sometime later, after a long journey, they finally set up camp. At the same time, the Duke sat and quietly read the documents. A moment later, a knight burst into his tent and called him. The Duke looked closely at the knight and said that it would appear that everything had gone well. Sebastian Dessen, the chief assistant to the commander, said with a smile that he could confidently say that everything went well. He smiled and said that they had done well. The cargo had been delivered to the rest of the squad and placed on the ship. The Duke knew that the transportation was necessary to resolve the military issue, but it was mainly needed by civilians. She was needed by those who acted as a witness in the case of the overthrow of the first prince. This was the original plan from the moment of marriage into the mission. Only the most faithful are initiated. The Duke knew that the prince had stolen his wife, and the one he had been looking for 6 years. He knew that this was a way to get rid of the first prince. The Duke tried the tea and was taken aback since Sebastian still had not learned how to make tea. Sebastian said with a smile that he was still much better than the lady. Sebastian said that it was soon the anniversary of her death, and she would appreciate it if he left a gift on the grave. The Duke sighed heavily and told his friend to watch his words. Sebastian smiled and said that in that case he would leave him. The Duke looked at his friend and asked if he had not said that the princess claimed that everything was fine. He told his friend that they needed to express their gratitude to her. Sebastian said that it was hard for him to accept. Sebastian looked at the Duke intently and said that he himself knew how they all respected his wife. The Duke was overcome with memories, and he remembered his wife. He sighed heavily and said that he knew about it. The Duke said that he knew that the fourth princess would not harm the North as he had studied the matter carefully. He approved of the princess because he knew she was not a clever one, and they said she was no smarter than a child. He was going to protect her like a younger sister. He wondered if she was as rumored. A moment later, a knight entered their tent and shouted that the battle had already begun. The young people froze in place in shock. Sebastian looked at the Duke and said that he would go and the Duke should rest and sort out the paperwork. Sebastian looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that tonight was his wedding night. The Duke sighed heavily as he was very tired. He knew that he needed to prepare himself for tomorrow. The Duke sighed heavily, for he knew that his wife would be very disappointed in him if she found out that he had married for the sake of revenge. He agreed to this alliance in order to gain the ability to move freely throughout the territories of the Day Force. He used the princess to get closer to the first prince. He was puzzled because he lacked words to justify himself. He knew that a lot of time had passed since his wife's death, but he still thought about her when he closed his eyes. He remembered the corners of her smile, her skin pale from the cold and her soft body. It was very hard for him because he couldn't protect her that day. He rushed over as soon as he read her letter, but he couldn't prevent death. Thoughts about it plunged him into despair every time. He tried to remember every detail about her death every rainy day. He visited the place of her death. He promised that those responsible for the murder and those involved in the crime would be beheaded. A moment later, he let his thoughts go because he couldn't. The princess came. He froze in surprise when he heard his name from her lips. She looked intently at the Duke and asked if he was there. She knew that in such a marriage there simply couldn't be a romantic first night. She thought he did it on purpose. She was, of course, pleased to see her husband rejecting other women, but she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The princess looked intently at the maid and called her the maid, in turn shuddered in surprise. A moment later, the princess asked the maid if she knew where the Duke was. Sonia said that she would find out right away and tell her where he was. The princess looked closely after the maid. She saw that she was very nimble. She knew that the dormouse understood that she had saved her life. She saw that the maid wanted to be close on good terms, but she did not strive for unwavering loyalty. A moment later, the princess heard her maid calling her in a hurry. The princess looked intently at the Duke and with a smile asked his permission to make him a cup of tea. She stared at him and didn't like the look on his face, but she wasn't going to go anywhere. He sighed heavily and told the princess that she didn't need to bother at all. She looked closely at the Duke as she noticed that he was already drinking tea. She raised that apparently everything was very bad since Sebastian was brewing the tea. They argued among themselves for a few minutes, as the Duke did not want her to make him tea, but the princess insisted. She looked at him intently because she did not want to back down. She looked at him and said that she did not want to drink tea outside. She said sadly that everyone hated her. She wanted to attack him with her beautiful eyes. The Duke, puzzled, said that she could have some tea and then go to bed immediately. The young lady in turn slowly brewed tea. The Duke noticed that she understood tea. He noticed it during the incident with the pearls. He simply didn't believe it. The Duke wondered if she had been treated so badly that she had to make her own tea. He looked at the princess intently, not understanding why he had a warm feeling when she handled the tea utensils. He in turn was confused and did not understand why everything was happening this way. She smiled and asked if he would like some tea, and the Duke agreed since she had tried so hard. The princess said with a smile that the tea should have cooled down by now. The Duke slowly picked up the cup and tasted the tea. He froze in place from shock. He remembered the taste Gabriella had once made, and whom he missed very much. The princess wished him good night and left. The Duke was puzzled as everything seemed strange to him. He knew that Gabriella also liked tea with honey. He wondered why the girl reminded him so much of Gabriella. He thought it was just a coincidence. He wondered if he should not put her in the East Wing, but observe her for a while. He had some strange feeling, and looking at the princess, he remembered his late wife. She was a respected duchess. She often did not laugh, but when she turned and gave him a radiant smile, he could not remain indifferent. In the end, he had to break the terms of the contract since they were not supposed to love each other. It was a very passionate love, as he was distracted by everything connected with her soft lips, long neck. The number of nights when he remembered her only increased, and on the day when he finally hugged her, it seemed to him that he needed no one else except her. And then it was taken away from him. He was furious because he just wanted to be happy. Ernst was furious and wondered who Princess Fiona was and why she made him tremble so. The next day, the young princess was leisurely walking around the camp. A moment later, she saw the knights sitting near the hearth. She froze for a moment as she saw that they were having dinner. She was a little puzzled as she saw that they were looking at her with disdain and wariness. She realized that they were looking at her with condemnation. As she walked past her carriage, she didn't notice the guards of the first and third princes. She knew that this was wrong, considering that the Northern Fleet was against them, but she didn't mind as much as she found it easier to move around without them. A moment later, she froze in place as she heard a terrible cough. The princess was very confused. Fiona looked at the people present and wondered if they were all sick. She looked at the maid and said that she had some books to do. The knights looked at the princess in bewilderment and asked what she had presented them with. Fiona smiled at the knights and said that she would like them to drink tea with honey, as she always drank it when she had a cold. She smiled and said that she wanted to help them, as she saw that they were coughing. The young people looked at the princess warily. The knights were skeptical and did not want to accept help from the princess, who smiled at them. Sonia was very angry. A moment later, she cried out in fury that it was just some kind of disappointment. Sonia screamed that they couldn't even have tea with honey. She was furious because it was difficult to prepare. She screamed that they used precious honey and cinnamon and also added lemon. Sonia was furious because she knew that the ingredients were not so easy to obtain. The princess gave her the hairpin and said that Sonia should show it if they refused to give her the ingredients. Sonia was furious because the cooking process itself was very difficult, and she had to stir the broth until she turned blue. The knight looked at the tea warily and said that they would try it. After he tried it, he froze in place as the concoction was very tasty. Sonia looked at all the knights and told them to stand in line. Sonia was furious because she couldn't believe that they didn't want to try the tea. She looked at them with fury and asked if they had nothing to say. She shouted that they should be grateful for the gifts. A moment later, the knights thanked the princess. The princess was sure that the maid would be pleased with these words. She looked closely at the knights as it seemed to her that they had stopped coughing. She remembered her past life because after marriage she was very indifferent and thought only about how to survive. Because of her indecision, she was able to approach the Duke only after many attempts. She was afraid that he might find out about her feelings. She was afraid that the same thing might happen to the knights, as she was afraid to approach them as they perceived her as a temporary duchess. She knew that she had better be kind to them and do everything she could to help them. She said with a smile that she would bring more tomorrow, but not as much, since there was little honey left. She wanted to do things differently because she realized that time was short. A moment later, she froze in place as she saw a familiar knight. She looked at Christian intently. She first saw him when he was 17. All the guards were special to her, but some stood out. Sebastian became her friend Christian, a member of the Belmer family. Vice Admiral Valken Tordas, assistant Ernst Gayen Igus always made her smile. And the bravest Bryngild Anetto. She missed them, no less than the Duke. A moment later, she sat down next to Christian and greeted him. The knight froze in place in surprise. She, in turn, could not believe that the child had grown so much. She saw that he was now older than her, but still to her, he was a child. He looked sideways at her and told her to stop following them and get back to the carriage. The young lady in turn understood that getting closer to him would not be so easy. A moment later she looked after him intently and called out to him. He looked at the princess in surprise and bewilderment and asked how she knew his last name since he had not told her about it. She said that she would go away. They would still have time to get to know each other, but still he should not have shown his contempt for her so openly. As she passed him, she said that this was simply not an officer's business. The young man was shocked by this statement and dropped the plate in surprise. The young lady noticed that he reacted to everything in the same way, and she found it amusing to pester him. She knew that if he saw her as a threat, he would definitely report everything, and he was probably just testing her now. But she in turn was just waiting for this because she wanted him to watch her. She knew that before he always followed her around. She understood that he could still recognize her as Gabriella. She understood that even if the Duke did not change his attitude towards her and they did not fall in love with each other, the fact that she was still a duchess did not change. She knew that everyone in the north had their own ocean, and their task was to illuminate it. Looking back, she already understood that she had overcome a difficult path, but still said about herself that this was not enough. The next day she was sleeping peacefully in the carriage, but suddenly she heard someone calling her. She opened her eyes as they kept calling her. She understood that everything had already begun. The young lady understood that now that the forces of day and the forces of night had united in rebellion, she could not avoid it. This was exactly what she was waiting for. The young lady looked at the knight intently and asked with a grin what had happened. The knight of the import was in turn very puzzled. He looked closely at the princess and said that his name was Gihan and he was responsible for transporting provisions. He said that if the northern troops came and demanded that they immediately share their food supplies, he asked her puzzled if she thought they would be the first to leave the port and load it onto the ship. Fiona was furious, wondering if he thought she was on the side of the day. He shouted that the northern fleet was terribly stupid and narcissistic. She asked with a smile if he could give it to her. The knight shouted furiously to the princess that he was sure that the Duke did not care about her, and now their task was to preserve the emperor's provisions. Since they could not be given away easily, the princess knew that he would say exactly that. She saw that the knight wanted the northern soldiers to beg for food. She understood that if she gave them half of the food, they would not do anything. She knew that the third prince did not even do business with them. She understood that this was her chance and an opportunity for growth for the emperor's confidant. The knight looked at her and told her to come out immediately to talk, since simply looking at him from the window was not enough. The princess looked at him intently and asked what she should do. She said that it seemed he had a difficult job ahead of him. The knight froze in place and looked at her in surprise. He didn't understand what she was even talking about. He knew that the emperor himself had entrusted him with an important matter, and this was his chance to succeed and strengthen his position since he was the emperor's nephew. He did not understand why his stomach twisted when he looked at her. The knight came closer to her and said that he thought she was still too young for such questions. He said that she was still too young. She looked at him with a smile and asked how he dared insult her husband's army. She told him not to even dare mention the honor of the emperor since it seemed to her that he imagined himself to be a monarch. With tears in her eyes, she said that it was the first time she had seen such a wealthy man. The princess said that just looking at him made her sick. She suggested that he return to the palace. The young man was shocked and shouted angrily, asking who she was to say such things to him. The princess, puzzled, said that she did not even want to see his comrades, since it seemed that she would now fall unconscious. She screamed that she wanted them all to leave immediately. She said that her brother would be furious if anything happened to her. The knights froze in shock, looking at the princess. At the same time, Christian was closely watching the princess, who said that she was not feeling well. He remembered the princess saying that she hoped their next conversation would be much more pleasant. She said that he shouldn't be such a softie just because he doesn't like someone. The young man was puzzled by her words, as he did not expect to hear something like that. The princess looked closely at the knight and said that he was now responsible for the movement. The knight looked at the princess in surprise and asked if she was really talking about him now. She said with a smile that it was exactly like that and asked if he really didn't want to. The knight said with a smile that of course he wanted to, since he was much better. The men in turn were furious and shouted that no one dared to stand in his way since he was close to the emperor. The knight looked at the man closely and asked if he had heard what the princess had just said. He shouted that he would be in charge now. A very strong fight broke out between the knights. The young lady in turn understood that everything was fine and everything was going according to her plan. A couple of days ago, she was handing out tea with honey and observing people and their relationships. She was constantly calculating who hated whom and found rivals. She was very happy because her result bore great fruit. Sebastian came closer to the princess and said with a grin that he saw a lot of interesting things. The young lady in turn did not expect to see him, and Sebastian gave her a radiant smile and wished her good morning. He introduced himself with a smile and said that his name was Sebastian and that he was an officer of the Northern Fleet. He looked at her intently and said that he could help her sort out this mess. She said with a smile that he could do whatever he wanted. The young lady, in turn, was very happy to meet him, but in turn, she wondered how long he had been looking at her. Sebastian looked at her intently and asking for forgiveness left. The young lady, in turn, looked after him intently with a smile on her face. The Duke slowly approached the princess and said that she should not witness such a spectacle. She was surprised because she did not expect to see the Duke. A moment later, the knights greeted the Duke. The princess looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that she was fine because the soldiers had protected her. The Duke said that of course it was so and it could not be otherwise. She knew he was already aware. Since his soldiers had come to her aid just as she was starting to have a conflict, he said in a puzzled tone that she shouldn't be a witness to such events. He told her to follow him since he would take her home. The princess grabbed him by the clothes and he looked at her in surprise. She shouted that she would not move from the spot until that man left. She understood that in order to improve their relationship, she needed to show whose side she was on. She understood that for this, she needed to get rid of the forces of the day without a drop of regret. Men in turn shouted that there was a misunderstanding. He did not understand how she could choose his cousin. The princess looked at the Duke with puzzlement as he walked towards the man. The Duke came closer to the knight and pinned his hand with his sword. The Duke looked at the knight with fury and told him to listen to him carefully. The Duke said that he was no longer responsible for the provisions and all workers would be eliminated. The knights obediently accepted the Duke's order. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was a good way to keep the enemy in his place. The Duke looked at everyone present with fury and pressed even harder on the knight's hand. He said that there was no need to do anything and asked if everyone understood. The young lady in turn froze in place looking at the Duke. The Duke turned slowly and found himself face to face with his wife. She looked intently at her husband for she saw that he did not want her to do anything. A moment later the maid rushed in haste towards the princess. Sonia rushed to the knight with lightning speed and shouted at him. She wanted him to immediately return the princess's hairpin. The princess in turn was very surprised and amazed. She did not expect the maid to behave in such a way. Sonia screamed because she was furious. She said that no one in their right mind would exchange an emerald hairpin for a jar of honey. The princess couldn't believe what was happening. Sonia said that the princess asked to make tea with honey for the soldiers. Sonia said that she asked the knight, and he said that he wouldn't give it to her for free, and their princess took out an emerald hairpin. And they were shocked and couldn't believe that they had been drinking such expensive tea all this time. They were surprised that she used an expensive piece of jewelry for this and thought it was a very sensitive gesture on her part. Sonia was furious and did not understand how the knight dared to deceive such a kind princess. The Duke looked at the princess with a puzzled expression. He was shocked. He didn't expect her to act like this. The Duke looked at the princess intently and said that the man who had shown disrespect to the princess had been sentenced to death. The Duke said that he had heard that soldiers who had caught colds began to recover because they drank tea with honey, and he was grateful to her. The Duke said that if she needed anything, she could ask him. The young lady said sheepishly that she had not meant to disturb him at all. He looked at her intently and said that she was not bothering him at all. The young lady froze in surprise. The young lady in turn reluctantly agreed with the Duke. She stared after him, expecting him to realize that she was Gabriella. She asked him to recognize her. She was puzzled because she could not tell him anything now. Sebastian looked hard at the Duke and said that he had expelled half the soldiers, and that was only those whom the Emperor had sent away personally. Sebastian looked hard at the Duke and said that the odds were clearly on their side. The Duke thought for a moment and said that it was surprising, but it seemed that their soldiers were favorably disposed toward the princess. Sebastian said with a smile that it was so. He said that the bosses often take advantage of their position to control the weak. He asked with a smile, "Isn't it refreshing? Difficult honey tea." The Duke looked closely at his friend and said that it seemed that he, too, had changed for the better. Sebastian thought for a moment and said that wasn't quite true. A moment later, the Duke looked away as he heard his wife's maid Sonia screaming and driving away all the visitors as the princess was very tired. Sebastian looked at the Duke closely and said that the soldiers had gathered because they were worried about the princess not leaving the carriage for a long time. He said that, unlike the third prince, the princess was very kind to the ordinary soldiers. The knights said that they were actually going to meet with the investigation team, sent by the royal family, and the princess was to join them. The Duke watched everything that was happening closely. He was puzzled because he knew that historically the royal family and the Duke's household had maintained a difficult atmosphere. Despite the difficult relationship, the parties tried to maintain a balance. The Duke knew that unfortunately the lands of the night lacked provisions. However, they had a lot of magic oil, the basis of the research of magicians, but it was found at the bottom of the ocean of the duchy. He knew that if the issue of exchange could be resolved, everything would not be so difficult. But unfortunately, they not only lacked provisions, they were tormented by a terrible night sickness. This disease is peculiar only to the North Sea, incurable. The development of the disease can only be stopped by gunpowder. The main ingredient is a bright grass. It grew only in the south in the temple. All this time they signed a contract beneficial to the royal family, but thanks to the marriage, the situation changed. The Duke knew that when a child was born, the union bore fruit, and 500 tons of bright grass were given out as a congratulation. He knew that they could accept the position that the royal family insisted on, but he was not going to accept anyone near him, except Gabriella. Sometime later, the Duke decided to visit the princess. The princess looked outside. She was surprised that the Duke came to her personally. She froze in place. The Duke looked at his wife in surprise as she flew straight towards him. The Duke, in turn, was very puzzled. He wondered if the smell of his wife could really be so familiar. He thought her smell was very strange and even irritated him. The lady, in turn, was puzzled. She did not understand what was going on and why her husband asked her to take a walk. The Duke glanced sideways at his wife and asked if she knew about the night sickness. She looked at him in surprise, and a moment later the Duke said that he would introduce her to the research team a little later. He looked closely at his wife and said that she would become the leader of the disease research team. He said the duchy had been trying to find a cure for the disease for a long time, but had failed, so they were very pleased to have the opportunity to bring together experts from different fields. A moment later, the Duke bowed before the princess and said that if she didn't like something, he would fix it. Lowering his gaze to the ground, he asked her not to expel anyone. The princess was puzzled as she did not expect to see such a thing. She agreed with him and told him to get up immediately. The Duke looked at her intently and thanked her. She looked at her husband intently and understood that a lot of time had passed since her death, but he had not changed at all. She saw that he was willing to sacrifice his own pride for the greater good. She knew that he was a true leader who would do anything for the duchy. She looked at her husband closely and said that she was not going to expel them. The princess said that there were many important people in the duchy, and this was her home now. She looked at him with a smile and said that they could make people happy together. A moment later, the princess froze in place as she felt ill. The Duke looked at the princess in surprise and called her. The young lady in turn was puzzled and did not understand what was happening. The Duke called her at this time, but all was in vain. The princess was puzzled and did not understand what she was feeling. She quietly said that she was in pain. A moment later, the princess fell to the ground unconscious, and with the speed of lightning, the Duke rushed towards her. She felt very warm and painful. She felt like a flame was flaring up under her feet. A moment later, she heard someone calling her and looked around in surprise, realizing that she was in the Duchess's bedroom. The Duke looked at her and asked with a smile why she had woken up so early. She said that her eyes opened by themselves and they had to board the ship. She was in shock because her lips moved by themselves. She looked at her husband and said that if he forgot, then she would punish him. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that it seemed the Duchess was testing his patience. He grabbed her by the waist with lightning speed and pulled her closer to him. She froze in bewilderment as she saw pink hair. The young lady stared at her husband as a few minutes ago she had clearly heard him call her Gabby, not Fiona. The maid dropped the plate on the floor and broke it because she saw that the princess had woken up. The maid looked at the princess intently and said that she was very worried and scared. Since the Duke personally carried her to her chambers, Fiona looked at the maid and asked if they had already sailed. Sonia said that they had not sailed yet as the wind was getting stronger, so they would have to wait until tomorrow. She was taken aback and said that she would go and tell the master that she was awake. The young lady noticed that she was in the captain's cabin. She knew that the best room on the ship was the captain's cabin. And of course the Duke simply had to move her to the best quarters, since she was ill. She saw that it was already evening, but she knew that it was not too late, and she had to get up and go meet the survey party. A moment later, the Duke entered the cabin and, asking for forgiveness, said that he had brought a doctor since she needed to be examined. She saw old Lorenzo and froze since he was still alive. He was a specialist who had long held the position of a doctor in a duchy where there were not many of them. He was one of the Duke's confidants. He said with a smile that he was glad to meet and introduced himself. He asked the princess if she would mind if he examined her. She smiled and said he could examine her, and a moment later the doctor began his examination. While she was being examined, she remembered what she had seen. She was curious about what it was since it didn't seem like an illusion. She remembered that he called her by her nickname, but she was in the body of a princess. The thought that it could have just been a dream turned her stomach. The images that sometimes suddenly fell on her head, and the pain from this was so sharp as if she was being burned alive. She could not even tell anyone, because no one would believe her. The doctor told her with a smile that there was no problem, and that she was probably just inconvenienced by the long journey. The Duke looked closely at his wife. He was very sorry that she was feeling ill. They thought everything was fine, but she knew no normal person would pass out after a trip up north. The Duke looked at her closely and said that she needed rest. A moment later, she called him and he stopped. The princess looked at the Duke closely and said that she felt much better, so she could meet with the disease researchers. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that this could be done tomorrow, but today she should have a good rest. The young lady looked at the Duke and objected to him, but still the Duke was unmoved. He said that they could leave this matter until the following morning. He slowly left the cabin. The princess was shocked because she saw that he didn't even want to listen to her. A moment later, she thought hard about what she had seen. She didn't know if it was a mirage or a dream, but she hoped that it was her future. She realized that he recognized her and was smiling sincerely at her. She stood and stared at the door. She understood that they still had a long way to go. The Duke stood late at night staring into the distance. He thought he was simply going crazy. He remembered how ill the princess was, and memories of his late wife came flooding back. He was in shock because he had a fear that was sealed deep in his heart. The doctor then said that she had become ill due to illness, but this worried him greatly since she looked terribly like Gabriella. He understood perfectly well that these were two different people, but still something confused him. For a moment he heard the princess's voice and froze in place in surprise. The princess looked at the Duke intently and asked with a smile if he had not eaten for an hour yet. He saw that she had brought him something to eat and noticed that she was not sitting still. The Duke looked at her intently and said that he had told her earlier that she should rest. The princess smiled and said that she would rest next to him. She offered him a sandwich and with a smile said that they could eat together. The Duke looked at her intently and said that he had already asked the scarf to bring him dinner, but still he did not refuse and took the food she offered. The princess smiled and said that the sandwiches were very tasty. The Duke decided not to refuse and began to eat. He froze in place as they tasted just like the ones his late wife had cooked. The princess looked intently at the Duke and said with a smile that she had asked the chef to cook something. The Duke looked away and said that he understood her. He was puzzled and could not look her in the eyes. The young princess looked at him in surprise and asked if he was all right. A moment later, the princess, looking at the Duke, began to sing a song. The Duke stood frozen in shock as he knew that the song was the song of the Nereid nymph. He was puzzled and did not understand why the princess was singing the sailor's song. The Duke, in turn, looked intently at the princess, who sang a beautiful song with a smile on her face. He was surprised and did not want her to stop at all. The Duke in turn could not take his gaze off the princess. Ernst felt peace in his soul. A moment later he heard a noise in the distance. The knights looked closely at the princess. They were amazed by her singing, but for some reason they felt sad in their hearts. They asked her if she knew any other songs. The princess looked at them with a smile and said that she knew, and suggested that they sing together. A moment later the princess sang various songs along with the reviews. Everyone was having fun, and the Duke of Ye in turn was watching them closely. He did not understand how this could be. He knew that no matter how people tried to pretend when they were tired, everything was noticeable. The Duke looked closely at the princess, and he saw that her sincerity made anyone who doubted it feel ashamed for it. He was puzzled and did not understand why he kept thinking about his late wife when he looked at the princess. He always wanted to know, but looking at the princess he told himself that he had to find out right now. He did not forget Gabriella even after her death. She often appeared in his memories, both in dreams and in reality. The doctor could not look at him in such a deplorable state and prescribed him medication. After that, he began to pretend that everything was fine, but unfortunately, he was never able to forget her. He did not understand why everything was happening this way. He thought that most likely for this reason, he could not take his eyes off the princess who reminded him so much of Gabriella. He tried to ignore her, but he couldn't do it anymore, because he knew he had to find out about everything. He wanted to understand why she reminded him so much of Gabriella. The princess looked at those present and had a good time with them. She was glad that they were imperial ambassadors, since at first she was afraid that they would be strangers. The young lady in turn was very glad that everything was okay. The princess looked at those present in surprise and asked if it was really so that not everyone could come. They said that it was so since Urien could not come because of his fear of the sea. The man looked closely at the princess and said that the young man was a magician, but he was not sure that his skills would be useful in this matter. The princess looked at her interlocutor and said that she understood. She understood that the man did not believe in magic. She knew that unfortunately, many in the empire treated magic that way. She believed in the existence of magic because she knew that the main characters of the story were essentially magicians. The young lady looked at the princess intently and called her. She said that upon arrival at the port they planned to go to the laboratory. She said that they would report on the results of the research and the budget for 3 months. The princess looked intently at Dr. Tricia Fabier. She is the current leader of the research team. The princess looked closely at the professor. Tricia in turn understood that the princess would not understand the report to the end, but still wanted to share it. The princess liked it. The princess looked at the professor with a smile and said that she would try to help them. They chatted casually for a while. The man looked at the princess and said that it seemed they would soon arrive at the place, but he noticed that she was not there. Those present were surprised as they did not notice how the princess disappeared from her colleagues with lightning speed and looked intently into the distance at her native land. The Duke in turn looked at the princess in surprise and called her. She turned around and gave him a radiant smile. The princess, looking at the Duke, said that they had finally arrived home. The Duke froze in shock as he didn't think she would say something like that. The Duke looked closely at the princess and sighed heavily. He understood that the path from the port to the mansion was not the shortest. The butler looked intently at the princess and greeted her. He smiled and said he was very pleased to meet her. He introduced himself and said his name was Owen. The young lady looked at the butler intently. She was very happy to see him. A moment later, she began to speak with a smile. But a few minutes later, she realized that she had forgotten that she had to act stupid. With the speed of lightning, she rushed to the butler and, embracing him, gave him a radiant smile and said that her name was Fiona. The butler, in turn, froze in place as he considered that the young lady was very strange. The butler hesitated and, looking at the princess, said with a smile that he saw that she was very charming. He smiled and said that the maid would take her to her chambers. Betty looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she seemed to be very tired from the journey, and she prepared a warm bath for her. She smiled and told the young lady that she could call her Grandma Betty. The princess rushed to embrace Betty with lightning speed and said with a smile that she was very glad to meet her. The Duke looked at the butler and said that he would go and rest. Betty looked at the princess intently and called her. The young lady instantly changed in the Lyceum and with a smile said that they could go now. The maid looked closely at the princess and asked her how she liked the temperature of the water. Fiona looked at her maid and told her to call her madam since she was a princess by birth, but now she was a duchess. The young lady in turn noticed a strange look on her Betty. She thought that Betty probably could not believe that a princess who had lived as a princess all her life could say something like that. Fiona looked at those present with a smile and said that she had already forgotten about the imperial palace. Sometime later, the young lady came out onto the terrace. She was very glad because she could smell the fresh sea air. She knew that, although she was not in the Duchess's chambers, she was glad that he had not sent her to the East Wing. She understood that since the Duke allowed her to stay here, he was gradually opening up to her. Betty looked at Madame closely and asked if she felt uncomfortable after meeting the Duke. Fiona thought for a moment and said that she did not. Betty looked closely at Madame and said with a smile that perhaps it was not noticeable, but the Duke was a very kind and good man. Betty smiled and told the young lady that she was sure she would like it there. The young lady in turn stood on the terrace looking into the distance, lost in her thoughts, when suddenly she heard someone enter. The Duke looked at his wife with embarrassment and said that it would be nice to act alone, but they would have to sleep in the same room for at least a week. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he would like to discuss something with her. She looked at him with a smile and invited him to sit down. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that he had several questions for her. He sighed heavily and, looking away from her, said that he knew that families of the day lived in separate rooms to preserve the personal space of the spouses. He looked at her intently and said that if she wanted to have a lover, it would be easier this way. He knew that she was a princess from the Dayforce family, so she must have already gotten used to this kind of thing. The young lady looked at her husband in confusion and asked what he was trying to tell her. The Duke said that night families live with their other half in the same room. He looked at her intently and said that if they were to stick to this rule, then she should not bring anyone. He asked if she agreed. The young lady looked at the Duke in confusion and said that she did not care at all. She looked at him hard and said that this was very bad. The Duke looked at his wife in surprise. He wondered what her reaction was. He saw that she was smiling and saying that she would like to share a room. She looked at him intently and said that he had said earlier that he had 2 questions. The Duke said that the question was regarding the guests of the mansion, as there was a girl named Charlotte Santrin, and she was turning 11 this year. Santrin family, a loyal family of the same rank as the Belmare, and their family only has a daughter. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that 3 years ago there was a major battle, and they fought with Count Santrin, but he died. The young lady in turn froze in place as she did not know what to answer. The Duke said that the Count died trying to defend him, and the Countess was a witness, so she asked him to take care of their daughter. He said bitterly that the fight ended in a bitter victory. After that, Charlotte became his weakness. Ernst sighed heavily. It was difficult for him to speak, but he still said that his daughter had an advanced night illness, and since he was in great debt, he allowed her to stay on the estate. The Duke told his wife that he knew perfectly well that this was a very selfish request, but he would like to make the girl a younger sister and leave her in the mansion. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and agreed with a smile. She said that it seemed that now she would have a beautiful sister. The Duke froze in place as he did not expect to hear such a thing. Fiona looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that she thought it wouldn't be that hard to adopt the young lady, but she had one condition: she wanted him to do it with her. The Duke froze in place and asked in surprise what she was talking about. The young lady looked at the Duke with an embarrassed smile and said that they could do it together. She smiled and proposed to him to get married. A moment later, the young lady told the Duke that they could have a marriage by arrangement. Ernst was stunned when he heard about the marriage contract. He understood that she had been behaving unpredictably up until then. He remembered his late wife who had said the same words. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that she would have only 4 conditions. Fiona said with a smile that the contract would be valid for 5 years. All this time, they would have to pretend to love each other. She said that she still hoped that they would try what they called love. The young lady looked at the Duke and said that they should respect each other as partners and would solve all problems by talking. She looked at him intently and said that she had one last condition. The Duke froze in place in anticipation. She said that if after 5 years anyone wanted to get divorced, they could renew the contract at any time. She looked closely at her husband and asked him with a smile what he thought about this. She knew that her last moments of life were full of regrets. She knew that she should have tried to get closer to her husband. She did not understand why she had hidden her feelings so much then. Now she regretted this most of all. The young lady in turn was no longer willing to waste time. She looked at her husband intently as she wanted him to understand that she was Gabriella. She knew that one day in the future they would simply look at each other hugging and talking for days on end. The Duke thought for a moment and said that unfortunately he was not good at pretending, and frankly he was not sure that the first conditions were feasible. He said that he simply did not think that he could love the princess. He looked at the princess intently and said that unfortunately she had been treated badly, and therefore he would try to avoid rumors about his unhappy life. The young lady looked at her husband intently and thanked him with a smile, saying that would be enough. She knew that she loved him much more than herself. She understood that even if there was no love between them, she needed him, and she did not want there to be hostility between them. She regretted that she could not look at his shining smile. The Duke looked at his wife intently and said that it was late and that it was time for them to go to bed. The young lady in turn understood that everything should be fine now. The next morning, the maids knocked on the door and asked Madame if she was awake. The young lady in turn was slowly stretching. They let her out, but told the maids that they could come in. The maid looked at her mistress with a smile and said that they would certainly help her get ready, and also introduced themselves. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked if she was the maid's granddaughter. The girl was embarrassed and looking at the lady asked how she knew about this. The princess smiled as she recalled the time when she last saw the young girl. She was 12 years old then, but now she had grown up a lot. The girl said that now she would be her personal servant. Fiona looked at Hazel with a smile and told her to take care of her. A moment later, the young lady asked the maid what was wrong with the Duke as she woke up and he was not there. The maid said with a smile that she had heard that the Duke had left for the port at 6 in the morning. The young lady in turn was not even surprised since she knew that her husband carried out all the duties of a duke without rest. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that she could not sit still and had to work. Coming out onto the terrace, all the servants greeted the lady. The young lady in turn watched the Merritts closely. She was very glad to meet. The butler greeted the lady. She looked intently at everyone present. The butler looked closely at the lady and asked if she had rested well. The young lady in turn thought for a moment, for there were times when she heard the greeting all morning, and it made her heart beat faster. A moment later, she saw a young, beautiful lady. A few minutes later, Charlotte greeted the lady and introduced herself. Fiona Wu saw the bottomless eyes, the deserted pupils. She realized that she had many symptoms of night sickness. The young lady greeted Charlotte with a smile and said that she was very glad to meet them. The princess introduced herself and said with a smile on her face that the girl could call her sister Charlotte. In turn was very happy as she did not expect such a warm welcome. The butler looked at the new lady intently. He was a little puzzled. Charlotte looked at the Duchess closely and said with a smile that she would like to give her a present. Charlotte said with a smile that she had made a beautiful scarf with her own hands. The lady smiled and said that it was very kind of her and it was very warm. A moment later, they heard someone calling Charlotte. They looked away in surprise. The young lady rushed to Charlotte with lightning speed and asked excitedly if she was all right and if she was hurt anywhere. Charlotte looked puzzled and said that she was fine and that the lady shouldn't worry. Fiona in turn looked puzzled at this scene. But a moment later, she looked up. "What's the matter?" She looked closely. "She lady." The butler looked at the young lady and said that she should still say hello. The lady looked at everyone present with a puzzled expression and said that she, of course, begged for forgiveness, but she was very worried about Charlotte. A moment later, she said that her name was Rachel and she was Charlotte's governess. Fiona glared at the worker as she hadn't even called her lady, and she hadn't even called Charlotte Miss. The Duchess looked at Rachel closely and said that if she ran around the corridors, she might get hurt. The Duchess said with a smile that she seemed to be unwell in the mornings, otherwise Charlotte would have learned bad manners. Rachel looked at the Duchess with the most innocent look, and asking for forgiveness said that she was not feeling well today, and asked the Duchess if she was angry. Fiona saw that the girl was playing the victim. The Duchess said with a smile that this simply couldn't be, since it was the first time she had seen a nobleman running along the corridor like that. She asked with a smile how she had managed to run like that. The Duchess smiled and said that when she was in that state it was hard for her to even move. The Duchess came closer to Rachel and said that it was simply amazing of her. The Duchess walked away from the lady with a smile and said that the greeting had not taken place due to the conflict, but they could greet each other formally. She looked at everyone closely and said with a smile that she was very glad that everyone had come on time. She said that from today onwards, they would greet each other at the same time. She looked at everyone present and said that she would not dismiss anyone for no reason, and that they should not worry. She said that she simply wanted to be friends with everyone who worked in the mansion. She looked at everyone present and said with a smile that there would be no daylight servants in the mansion. However, she said that they were not allowed to offend her maid. A moment later, she said with a smile that she had good news. The young lady looked at Charlotte intently and said with a smile that she would now be a little princess. She looked at those present and said that this was the end of the conversation, and from this day on, they should perceive Charlotte as the Duke's younger sister. Everyone froze in surprise, as they did not expect to hear such a thing. Charlotte, in turn, also froze, looking at the Duchess. She was puzzled. A moment later, all the servants greeted the young lady. The Duchess looked at Rachel intently and asked what she was staring at. Rachel, in turn, looked at the Duchess with fear. The Duchess looked at the lady with a grin and asked if she wasn't even a fan. The Duchess looked closely at the lady and said with a grin that she had made the right choice after all, and from now on, Charlotte could only be addressed as Miss. The young lady was surprised but did not answer. She froze in place. Rachel was very angry because she had been told earlier that the princess was just a fool. She was sure that she was the only noble person in this mansion. She had previously thought that she would someday be with the Duke. For this reason, she decided to become a teacher, but now she was furious and did not understand what the forces of the day were allowing themselves. A moment later, walking down the corridor, she saw the Duke. The young lady rushed to the Duke with the speed of lightning and called him. Rachel reached out to the Duke as she wanted to take his hand. She looked at him intently and said that she had something to tell him. Sebastian, with the speed of lightning, stood between them and called Rachel. The young lady stood still, furious that he had come between them, but said nothing. A moment later, her face changed, and she told the Duke with a smile that she had heard that Charlotte was to be his sister. She congratulated him with a smile. Sebastian looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if this had already been announced. He was surprised because there had been no official statement yet. The young lady in turn understood that this fact had come to light before the publication of the official document. She wondered if the princess had just blabbed. The young lady said with a smirk that the princess seemed to be terribly impatient. She knew that this was a very good chance to humiliate the princess in front of the Duke. She looked closely at the Duke and said with a grin that she was very worried. Sebastian in turn watched the lady closely. She said that day people simply can't stand those with the night sickness. She said that Charlotte might suffer because of the princess. With tears in her eyes, she said that she was her teacher and was very worried about the young lady. The Duke looked at her hard and said that she must now call Charlotte lady. He asked her if the princess had not told her about this. The young lady in turn was puzzled and looked intently at those present. The Duke looked at her intently and said that his marriage was a matter of business, both public and private. The Duke looked at the lady with fury and said that this question did not concern an ordinary governess. He looked at her one last time and said that he very much hoped that she would not bother him with such matters again. The young lady froze in shock, looking after the Duke and his retinue. Rachel froze in shock because she knew that the princess had used magic to mislead everyone. Rachel knew that she needed to find out the truth as soon as possible and reveal it to everyone. Fiona had heard that there was another member of the royal family in the West Wing. She knew his name was Johannes. Fiona looked at the butler, puzzled. A moment later, she sighed heavily and asked the butler how much a change of mood cost. The butler in turn looked at his mistress with bewilderment and said that he had long dreamed of this, but it must be very expensive. He looked at her and said the price. The young lady froze in place as it was not cheap. She knew that the main problem was that the money only moved within the duchy. She knew that currency could well figure in trade matters, but there was a reason why it was not so easy to attract foreign merchants. It was all because of the polar night. Since the dark days began in autumn and ended in late spring, the sun almost did not rise for half a year. Because of this, merchants avoided the duchy. The young lady looked at the butler intently and said that it would be very good if the duchy became a tourist spot. The butler froze in place in shock, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He remembered how the former lady, sighing heavily, said that people of the strength of the day had never seen the polar night. She wondered if they would not be interested. She smiled and said that there was a polar night in the duchy, and she had never seen anything like it before, and surely others were also interested in seeing such a sight. The butler saw that the young lady was now speaking as if she were his former mistress. She knew that Gabriella had no connections with the day powers, so she retold to look for a way to make money, but Princess Fiona had many connections. She knew that the princess had a lot of advantages. The young lady looked at the butler intently and said with a smile that she had a brilliant idea. The butler froze in place looking at the young lady, as he had the impression that they had known each other for a long time. Fiona spent a lot of time looking around the castle and didn't notice that it was time for dinner. A moment later, she heard Charlotte calling her and looked at her closely with a smile on her face. Charlotte smiled and greeted the young lady. The Duke, in turn, gave her a radiant smile and asked how her first day in the duchy had gone. Fiona looked at them with a smile and said that her day was just wonderful. She was very happy because she was able to visit all the places from her memories. She walked slowly as she wanted to sit down in her place, but a moment later the Duke told her to wait a little. He walked up to the chair and looked at her with a smile and told her to sit down right there. The Duke looked at the young lady and said that this was now her home too. The young lady in turn looked closely at all the servants. She understood that they were pretending not to watch them. Fiona understood that the Duke had just significantly increased her status. She knew that in the end this was how it should be. Fiona understood how he had said that she was not being treated well, so he would try to avoid rumors about his unhappy life. Now she understood what efforts he had spoken of then. She looked closely at her husband and sheepishly agreed with him, but at the same time her heart began to beat faster. She was very embarrassed by his kindness, and thanks to him, everything turned out well for her. The young lady looked at Charlotte intently and asked her with a smile what she wanted to be when she grew up. Charlotte smiled and said that she wanted to be an artist, namely an artist who paints not with her eyes but with her heart. Fiona looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if that was true. She said that she really hoped to see her paintings again. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and asked with a smile if she could show him the paintings as well. Charlotte sighed heavily and said that unfortunately they were both very busy. The Duke looked at the young lady and said that they would be close by and she could come at any time. Fiona looked at the Duke and asked if Charlotte should be given a brooch. She said that if it was worn on her chest, the young lady could be admitted to any office and they needed to warn the guards right away. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said with a smile that this was a very good idea. Charlotte looked at them intently and said sheepishly that she would think about it, as she did not want to disturb them at all. The young lady looked at her husband closely and asked how the third prince's inspection of the West Wing had gone. The Duke said he had received some extremely boring reports and he seemed to not want to go out and just sat in his room for days. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked how long the prince was going to stay in the duchy. He looked at his wife and said that he heard that the prince would be in the estate for about a month. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she had picked it up. Ono in turn knew that it was a lot, and she thought that it would be much better if he didn't hang around in the room all day long. She knew that after dinner her husband would immediately go to the office, but she really wanted to talk to him longer. Fiona looked at her husband closely and asked with a smile if he would like to have a drink with her. She looked at him intently and said that they could drink to the Count and Countess of Saint-Rene. The Duke was surprised. A moment later his expression changed, and he looked at his wife with a smile. The Duke looked at his wife in surprise and said that she didn't seem to like cucumbers. The princess sighed heavily and thoughtfully said that it was so, and she hardly ever ate them. He looked at her and said that it was very surprising, but the previous duchess did not like them either. The young lady sighed heavily and said it was a coincidence. He looked at her closely and said it was definitely a coincidence. A moment later, he asked if she could choose a brooch. He said she could choose any, since he had received a report that she had not taken very many things with her. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that it was not worth doing. She knew that she better not spend money on it, since it would be better to invest it in a mansion. He looked at her intently and said that if she was saying this for the sake of economy, then she should not worry about such things as there was enough money for the contribution. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She did not understand what his words meant. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that she knew that the imperial palace paid about 200 coins a month, considering that the imperial family spent about 700 coins a month. It was not that much. She knew that she could change the tiles and curtains with that money. He looked at her and said that he would like to ask for help. The Duke slowly handed her the document and said that it had Charlotte's middle name written on it, but he didn't even know if it was right. The young lady was surprised. She wondered if Charlotte had written it herself. She looked at the Duke and asked, "What about Charlotte X?" The Duke smiled sheepishly and said that it was not bad and they could leave it as it was. Fiona looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that the butler had told her that there were certain places she was not allowed to go. She asked him with a smile if he wanted to tell her what this place was, and the Duke looked at her intently. A moment later, they were leisurely strolling around the estate. Looking at his wife, the Duke said that she was allowed to go everywhere, but he still hoped that she would not go into the underground prison. A moment later, he said that he did not want her to go into the former Duchess's bedroom, as it was not a place for everyone, and he hoped that she would not visit it. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if she could just look into the room once, as she just wanted to know what the previous Duchess was like. The Duke, in turn, looked at her intently but said nothing. A moment later, they finally entered the former Duchess's room, and the young lady froze in shock. She didn't understand why nothing at all had changed in the room. She looked at everything in the room with a gentle smile, and it seemed as if time had stopped. The Duke looked at her closely and said that the room had not been cleaned for a long time, so dust might have settled. The young lady in turn understood that this was a blatant lie, since at first it might seem so, but the room was completely clean. She had been told earlier that no one could enter the room, and she suspected that the Duke had put things in order. He looked at his wife intently and said that he knew he should have sorted this out before the new marriage, but unfortunately he couldn't. The lady was shocked and just couldn't believe that he hadn't done anything. She looked at her husband intently and asked why he had not done anything. The Duke froze in place, not knowing what to answer, and timidly said that he still loved her. The young lady froze in place, which was something the cat did not expect to hear. She wondered if he had not forgotten her yet. She thought that after a long time he would forget about her. She thought that he would never look at her again. The young lady was shocked. She wondered if their feelings were mutual. She remembered sleepless nights when she put down on paper her feelings that she could not express. Then she wrote tear-soaked letters that she would never send to him. She was puzzled because if only she had known about his feelings, their relationship could have turned out differently. A moment later, the lady made the book fall on the table. The Duke looked at her in surprise and confusion and asked what she was doing. She timidly asked for forgiveness, but a moment later the letters appeared in front of them. The Duke was surprised and did not understand where the letters in the book came from. She looked at him intently because she knew he would now read her letters, because on lonely nights she thought about how much she loved him and cried, laying out her soul on paper. Fiona, in turn, understood that it was already late, but she would like to tell him about her feelings and how lonely she was. She came closer to him and called the Duke froze in place in surprise as she took his hand. A moment later, the Duke pulled away from her. The young lady froze as she did not expect such a thing from him. A moment later, the Duke asked her forgiveness and said that she had better go to her chambers. The young lady slowly carried out his order and left him alone in the room. As soon as the young lady left him, the Duke fell to the ground with lightning speed and sighed heavily. He was puzzled because he knew she had said everything was fine, but he felt as if she had been hurt by his confession. Ernst was puzzled because he did not think at all that their relationship with Gabriella would end so soon. He knew very well that she was very impulsive. He was surprised and puzzled that his current wife and his late wife had similar preferences. As soon as he entered the room, his late wife, the princess, immediately found the hidden letters. He wondered if there were a few coincidences. He was excited and wondered if Gabriella could be reborn as a princess. He sighed heavily because he knew that he was just having crazy thoughts. Ernst, sometimes he thought that it would be better if you that day they died together. He understood that he just made it all up because he missed her so much. But he in turn did not understand why he felt so uncomfortable. He wondered why he wanted so much to be kind to the princess. He did not have the slightest idea why everything was happening exactly this way. But in turn he knew only one thing, that Gabriella was the only woman he truly loved. The Duke in turn was firmly convinced that he would never replace her. The young lady sat and slowly read a book. She had been in the duchy for a whole week already. As time passed, she went through all the old books in search of the Eki's relic. Fiona was very happy because she was finally able to find a clue. Dinuat, goddess of the moon, everyone's favorite sea serpent. Among its descriptions are the following. The snake's name is Leviathan, the lunar snake and guardian of the sea with a third eye. He is in front and behind and on the right and on the left, above and below the sky and the sea and everywhere and nowhere. She hides in the smooth waves. She read that the moon cannot be blamed for its long life in the sky. The only thing is that this darkness does not age, and those who apply this information can find glory in its radiance. The young lady in turn was puzzled, for she did not know what it meant, but it was evidently prose about the relic. She in turn wondered what happened to the ring that she swallowed. She knew that if she had not done so, it would have been taken by enemies. She knew that the Duke definitely didn't have the heirloom. She wondered if the family ring was still in the Duchess's body. She was puzzled because she knew she was now part of the forces of the day, so she couldn't just talk about it. She wanted to wait a little until the Duke himself spoke about it. She understood that she would have to wait for more than just that. She looked closely at the young lady. She knew that the time would come when it would be best to start looking for a cure for the night sickness. The young lady in turn knew that the medicine was made by a saint, using the tears of a unicorn, a divine concentrate that could cure any disease. According to rumors, she heard that one drop could resurrect the dead. She knew that the extraction of unicorn tears can be done on the border of the territory, the forces of day and night in the shining forest, and only those with a pure heart can meet the unicorn. She knew that if you get unicorn tears, then the eyesight of the young lady can be cured easily. A moment later, Sebastian entered the book. He looked closely at the Duchess and said with a smile that news had arrived that Galahad would soon arrive. Charlotte smiled as she looked at the young man and asked if Hilda and Valken were coming. The young lady in turn wondered if they had been sailing. Sebastian looked at Madame and said with a smile that he would like to explain everything to her briefly. He said that Galahad's main mission was to protect merchant ships from pirates. He said with a smile that if she looked at the map, he would tell her everything faster. He said that the duchy was surrounded by sea, and below were their sworn enemies, the Delpart. And it was Delpart who discovered a merchant ship heading to the eastern continent to the kingdom of Schlock and launched a pirate ship. Looking at the Duchess, he said that they protect merchant ships from pirate ships and are paid accordingly. He said that the family's navy specializes in pirates, and thus they form a military triangle. The young lady in turn looked at him with a smile and said that thanks to them, many countries receive naval assistance, and because of the relief of the continent in order to get to the kingdom, it is necessary to cross their sea, and in winter and autumn there are polar nights. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she was very clever, and he was thinking of having a small celebration in honor of Galahad's return. He asked with a smile if she could take care of it. The lady in turn looked at him with a smile. She was very glad, since organizing a party in honor of the fleet. Salute was a great privilege. She knew that so that the Duke would not regret entrusting her with such a matter, she would take a good look around and prepare as needed. The young lady looked at Charlotte intently and asked if she would like to join her as they could go shopping. Charlotte smiled and said that it sounded like fun. But a moment later she drooped and said that she thought her presence would cause her some inconvenience. She thought it would be better for her to remain in the castle. The Duchess looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The Duchess looked at Sebastian intently and asked if Charlotte had never been invited anywhere. The young man thought timidly. A moment later, he said that it seemed the lady had never gone for a walk before the Duchess was shocked by such a statement. She screamed that such a thing simply could not be. She in turn understood that men could not understand the feelings of a young girl. She came closer to the young lady and said that she was not a burden to her, and she would not interfere with her shopping in any way. The Duchess smiled, looking at the girl, and said that she very much wanted her to go with her. The Duchess smiled and said that she was very much looking forward to sharing the warmth of the sun with her today. Looking at Charlotte, she said that she would like to show her the events of the busy streets. The Duchess looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she would like to spend the day with her. Charlotte was amazed by what she heard. She looked at the Duchess with tears in her eyes and said that she also wanted to pop in for dessert near the square, as her governess said that the peach pie there was very tasty. Charlotte looked at the Duchess with a smile and said that she would like to know what fresh flowers smell like. Sebastian looked at the young lady with a smile on his face. He was very glad that everything was happening this way. The young lady in turn looked at the Duchess with a smile and said that she was looking forward to tomorrow. The Duchess smiled and said that she was also looking forward to tomorrow. The next day they rode slowly into town. The Duchess was very puzzled. She looked intently at the young people and did not understand how it all happened. The prince looked at his sister and said that she looked rather gloomy. The young lady in turn was furious as she did not expect him to go with them. A moment later, she said that the pink sugarhead looked frightening when she was angry. The prince looked at his sister with fury and asked what she called him. The Duchess sighed heavily and covered the young lady's ears. She told her brother to keep his expression to himself. She looked at him intently and said that they were part of the same imperial family, so even Z had to watch his facial expression. He looked at her with puzzlement and surprise and told her to speak normally. The young lady looked at him with surprise and asked what he was talking about. He said angrily that she ignored him and started talking about her own. The young lady looked at her brother intently and said that he ignored her first. She looked at him sharply and asked how he dared to address Mrs. X so disdainfully. The prince looked at her with fury. She in turn tried not to pay attention because he was also unlucky, but she did not understand how he dared to behave like that. Fiona remembered that Johannes had always been the victim. The first prince, the son of an empress, the second prince, the son of a queen, and Fiona and Johannes, the children of unknown overseas empresses. The second prince grew up without a mother, so he took out his anger on Johannes, and he stopped smiling altogether. She looked at her brother closely and said with a smile that the moon was very beautiful. Unfortunately, at some point, he stopped paying attention to his sister. It seemed to her that he was probably just driven into a corner. She understood that, of course, this was a very unpleasant story, but she could not do anything. She knew that it was quite another matter to ignore the Grand Duchess. She knew that she was the very essence of cold-bloodedness, and no one should treat her so carelessly, since hatred for her was equal to hatred for the North Sea. The young lady understood that it was simply impossible to ignore the prince's behavior. A moment later, they were informed that they had arrived at Piazza Gregorio. The young lady in turn looked around intently, wondering where they should start first. The Duchess looked around for a while, but a moment later a girl came up to her and called out. The little girl looked at the Duchess intently and said that a tall and very handsome man had asked her to give him something. The Duchess was surprised she saw the seal of the Eckes mansion on the envelope. She wondered if the letter really belonged to the Duke. The letter was indeed from the Duke. He wrote that he had contacted the boutique in advance, and the boutique would prepare the best dresses for them. He wrote that she should go there soon. The young lady in turn was shocked by what she read, as she knew that the boutique was the most expensive. She was shocked and wondered how much he had paid to book the time. She knew that he did not have money to renovate the mansion. She did not understand why he had decided to take on this issue at all. The knight looked at the Duchess intently and said with a smile that the Duke had prepared something for her. He asked if she would like to see it. The young lady looked at the knight with a puzzled expression and agreed. The Duchess in turn was embarrassed and very glad that the Duke treated her like that, and she simply could not refuse, since he took very good care of her. Sometime later, they finally arrived at the boutique and were greeted by the store owner. She looked at those present with a smile and said that her name was Madame Nureta. Madame said with a smile that when she heard that the Grand Duchess was coming, she immediately thought of the best dresses. Madame looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that His Excellency had asked her to take care of her. She said that she would help her and create the best outfits for her. Sometime later, the Duchess tried on various outfits. Madame said with a smile that in front of the sailors, one should change no more than 5 outfits, purely out of politeness. The young lady in turn was very tired, and looking at Madame told her to stop. Madame looked at the Duchess with a smile and asked if it was too little. The Duchess in turn said that it was not. The Duchess looked at Madame sharply and said that she would not be buying the dresses, and Madame needed to return the payment that her husband had made. Madame froze in place in shock. The Duchess looked hard at Madame and told her to think about it for herself, as she would be the only one in expensive clothes, and it would be very sad if the officers who always wore old clothes looked at her. The Duchess, in turn, knew that this shop had no competitors, so it would not work to say that they would go elsewhere. She looked closely at Madame and said that she did not want to look better than the officers. Madame looked at the Duchess and said with a smile that her younger brother sews men's clothes, and she could trust this matter to him. The Duchess asked with a smile whether it was really as a gift, and she thanked Madame with lightning speed. Madame looked at the Duchess in surprise. A moment later she said that it would be as a gift. The Duchess was very happy. The Duchess said with a smile that now she could calmly buy herself an outfit. Madame was very surprised and happy. The prince watched everything that was happening closely. He thought his sister Bee looked like a hunchbacked silkworm. He understood that she would never change. He in turn was very puzzled since his whole life was an endless feast. He was a prince who did not renounce the right to the throne, but at the same time did nothing. Good alcohol appearing at the flick of a finger, fancy desserts all around. He knew it was nice not to have anything to think about when someone was drunk. He constantly inhaled the sweet feminine scent. But there was one reason why he still remained in the duchy. He knew that he could not leave the duchy so easily since his sister now lived there. The young lady looked out the window and said with a smile that she would go there tomorrow. She pointed to the sky. She said with a smile that the day was over and she had come to say goodbye. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He understood that every time he thought about her, he regretted it. She looked at him and said with a smile that someone else would get into her body and his sister was marrying a very good man. He looked at her with a grin and asked if she had really gone crazy. Now he understood that he shouldn't have said that then. Now he realized that he shouldn't have let her go so easily. He didn't realize then that the more he ignored her, the more attached he became to her. She looked at him intently and asked for help. The young lady looked deep into her brother's eyes and quietly said that he should not leave her. She wanted him to reach out to her first. The prince was shocked and did not understand what she was talking about or what she was thinking at all. The young lady looked into the distance with a smile. A moment later, she glanced sideways at her brother and said with a smile that the golden crown suited him. He sat quietly for a while, deep in thought. He remembered her saying that they were part of the same imperial family, so he should watch his expression. He knew it was quite clever of her. He was puzzled and had no idea what kind of help she was asking for, but he wanted to do everything he could. And if she ever needed his help, he would be there. He really wanted to hear her last request. The young lady, in turn, was surprised and puzzled. She did not understand where the teacher had gone since she had promised to look after Charlotte. Her brother had also disappeared somewhere unknown. A moment later, the young lady stumbled and screamed loudly. The Duchess looked at Charlotte in surprise. Charlotte looked at the Duchess with alarm and said that she had something under her foot. The Duchess was surprised. A moment later, she stepped in the direction Charlotte was pointing and froze in place in shock. A few minutes later, she pulled off her invisibility cloak and saw a man on the ground. The young man rose from the ground and thanked them for finding him. He said that if he had continued lying there, he would have died of hunger. The young man looked at them intently and said that he was not a bad person at all, and his name was Urion Nibelungen. The young lady in turn froze in place from shock and surprise as the name was familiar to her. The young man was a researcher of night sickness and a magician whom she unfortunately was unable to meet on the ship. The young lady in turn remembered that she could not meet him because of the dizziness. She was surprised because she did not think at all that she would ever be able to meet him. He looked at the young ladies and said that he was a vegetarian, so he had not eaten for 3 days and decided to sneak into the restaurant, but he ran out of strength and stayed here. He said that he wore an invisibility cloak so that no one would notice him. The young lady looked at the young man intently and said that she understood everything, and she would provide him with a personal chef who would prepare the dish for him. She looked at him intently and said that it was very unexpected. The young man looked at her intently and said that today's horoscope had said that he would meet the Queen of Snakes, and it turned out to be true. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her with a smile and thanked her. She knew that the princess's birthday was on the 2nd of April, and she was a fish according to the zodiac sign, and Gabriella's birthday was on the 15th of December, and she was the last sign of the zodiac, the Lord of the Snakes. She looked at the young man intently as she was puzzled, as it seemed to her that he looked straight into her soul. She looked at him with a smile and said that he seemed to be mistaken since she had a different zodiac sign. A moment later, a knight approached them and told her that the carriage was already ready. The young lady looked at the knight and told him to buy the young man some food and take him home. She looked after him intently and said that if he really was who he said he was, then they would see each other again in the hospital. The knight looked closely at the young man and asked what he was waiting for. Urian in turn understood that meeting such a noble man was simply amazing. He was surprised and did not think at all that in the lands from which magic had long since disappeared, such a soul would be found. It seemed to him that the young lady was not yet familiar with magic, but he understood that her soul loved the glow of magic, and it is usually called trembling. He knew that the stronger the trembling, the more powerful the magic. He didn't think at all that she could already control it, since she had not fully awakened. He stared intently after the young lady, since he thought that this was all very funny. The Duke sat and slowly read letters from his late wife. He was very interested in what the young lady was thinking about while she was writing these letters. He did not understand how she managed to describe all her thoughts. He remembered very well her habit of biting her pen. He knew that she seemed to be trying to capture every elusive thought. He knew that he would never forget her for the rest of his days. The Duke understood that he had to write about this short-lived love. It made his heart ache with longing. He understood that he would never receive an answer, but he could leave the letter near the grave flowers. The Duke looked hard at the young lady and asked how their walk had been. The Duchess smiled and said it had been very merry. She looked hard at the Duke and asked if Rachel had come back, for she had suddenly disappeared somewhere and she was very worried. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that he needed to tell her something about her. The Duke said that he would like to entrust Charlotte's education to her, since the young lady had been chosen only because she had the best command of the ancient languages. The Duke said that if his wife thought she was unsuitable, someone else could be chosen. The young lady in turn looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that she was still not well informed, so she would just continue to observe. She had said earlier that she would not remove without reason, so she just needed to wait. She looked at him intently and said that she was grateful for the clothes, but they were very expensive. The Duchess said that for that money they could have renovated the castle. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he did not want to change the mansion. She sighed heavily because she understood that she would not be able to convince him otherwise. The Duke looked at his wife intently and said that the knights would be arriving soon so they could decorate the ballroom, but the rest of the castle would remain unchanged. She sighed heavily and asked when he planned to sort out the castle, as many things needed repair. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he would do everything when she came back to life. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he said. She looked at her husband in confusion and said that the mansion was already old, and at this rate it would soon fall apart. The Duke sighed heavily and said with a grin that this was also not bad. The Duke walked slowly around the office, lost in his thoughts. The Duke sighed heavily and calmly asked what the lady had done. The knight hesitated, not knowing what to answer, but a moment later he said that the lady had taken almost nothing. Sebastian said with a smile that the lady was not as stupid as rumors said. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it seemed so. Sebastian looked at the knight intently and said that it seemed that her ladyship had mentioned some other boutique. The knight said that was not the case, and as far as he knew, the boutique had no competitors. Sebastian said in surprise that usually in such situations people say that if they don't do this, they will go somewhere else. The knight sighed heavily and said that if the lady had said something like that, then in the end she would not have been able to come to an agreement since the boutique had no competitors. Sebastian looked at the Duke intently and said that the young lady spoke as if she already knew that the boutique had no competitors. The Duke looked at Sebastian closely and asked what he thought, and also asked him to give his opinion as a friend. Sebastian sighed heavily and thoughtfully said that he was not sure, but still he understood something. Sebastian looked at the Duke intently and said that their lady was far from being a fool. He said that she could read old books fluently. He was surprised but still said that the girl was very smart, and her behavior in the fitting room confirmed this once again. He said with a grin that you wouldn't wish such an enemy on anyone. The Duke thought for a moment and said that it seemed the young lady had no evil intentions since she had helped find Gabriella's hidden letters. Sebastian looked at the Duke in surprise as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He said that the young lady could have asked for something in return, but she did not. The Duke sighed heavily and said that this was exactly the case. He was puzzled and did not understand why he was now taking her side. Sebastian looked at the Duke closely and said that she could be trusted, but he would keep an eye on her. He said that she needed someone nearby who could not only watch but also protect her if necessary. The Duke looked at the young man closely and asked if he had any ideas. Sebastian said with a smile that of course he had an idea. The young lady looked at the knight intently and asked if she looked okay in her outfit. Christian said with puzzlement that she was very beautiful. The young lady looked at the knight closely and asked if he was sure it was a good choice. She said that a lot depended on the choice since she would be wearing this outfit at the ceremony. Looking at the knight, she asked, "What about the ankle bracelet?" He looked away and said it was very beautiful. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was even looking. Baring her ankles, she told him to take a look. The young man was puzzled and asked why she was showing him her legs. He turned away. She smiled and asked how he liked the bracelet and if it was visible. He sheepishly said that the bracelet looked wonderful. She asked with a smile how he could say that if he hadn't even looked. He timidly said that she had beautiful pale legs and the bracelet was wonderful. He was shocked and didn't understand why she was suddenly doing this and what she was planning. The young lady looked at him intently and asked with a smile. If he was embarrassed, Christian shouted that this was not the case at all, but in turn he was very embarrassed. She said with a smile that he was shy. The young man froze in shock as he remembered that the late Duchess had always told him that he was shy Christian. He looked closely at the Duchess as she spoke in Gabriella's words. The young lady looked at the knight in bewilderment and asked what happened as his face was different. He looked at her intently. As for a second it seemed to him that he was looking at Gabriella. He was shocked and did not understand why he continued to confuse them. In turn, he understood perfectly well that he should not be hopeful at all. He understood that the idea that her soul had entered the body of the princess was unrealistic since such things only happened in books. He understood that he should not be mistaken. The Duke and Duchess walked slowly towards the carriage as they were already due to leave for the event. Fiona in turn was very excited but at the same time happy since they would finally meet. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that she seemed to be in a very good mood. She looked at him with a smile and said that it must be because she was riding in the same carriage with him. The young lady in her turn looked intently at the Duke, for she thought that he must be doubting her stupid scale. She was leaving clues from Playful, her role. She wanted very much for him to recognize her. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and asked him with a smile if he liked the outfit as it was made in the boutique he had chosen. The Duke looked at her intently and said that it was beautiful. She looked at him intently and said that he had said the words to her with an indifferent air. She asked if he believed himself. Ernst looked intently at his wife and said that he was quite serious and that she was very beautiful. He said that men would not be able to take their eyes off his wife. The young lady in turn understood that he was lying. She remembered how in a past life he told her that she was very beautiful. She knew very well the face he made when he told the truth. A moment later, a man approached them and said that time was running out. The Duke looked intently at his wife and told her to go and get into the carriage. She slowly came closer to him and taking his hand tenderly, said that he was also a man. She looked intently at her husband. He froze in surprise but said nothing. A moment later, he turned around and left. The young lady looked after him puzzled but said nothing. The knight looked intently into the distance. He was very glad because he knew that they would arrive soon. The Navy Admiral sighed heavily and said that it was so and they would arrive at the mansion today. The Colonel said with a smile that he was looking forward to drinking the wine they had taken from the pirate ship. He looked at the Admiral and asked with a smile if they would have another chance. The Admiral sighed heavily and said that it was indeed so. He was surprised and did not think that there would be alcohol on the ship. The Colonel smiled and said that the Duke had recently been married, so wine would be a great gift, but he was still puzzled and said that he was a little worried about it. He knew that the Colonel could not stand the forces of the day, and the new lady was from those lands. The young man was puzzled and wondered what would happen if he attacked her. The Admiral sighed heavily and said that this also worried him. He said that he very much hoped that she was a kind and indulgent person and suitable for their master. A couple of days ago, the Duchess gathered the servants in the mansion. She looked closely at the documents and asked Zimmer if he had taken his son and grandson on board. The man looked at the Duchess with surprise and bewilderment and said that everything was exactly like that. She looked at him intently and with a soft smile said that it was possible to leave them at home since she thought it would not be easy for him. He looked at her confusedly and said that it was not so as they would need workers there and he was glad that his family could help. The man was shocked and simply could not believe that he was working for such a woman. She looked at everyone present and said that he was a role model for everyone, so she was giving them 35 days of paid leave. Everyone present was shocked. She looked at him sharply and said that the vacation was given fairly and she gave each worker a day of vacation for every year of service. She looked at them sharply and said that they could go on vacation, and when they came back, their jobs would still be theirs. The Duchess looked at Gans and said that he had 2 weeks of vacation, and Angelina had 20 days of vacation. She looked closely at those present and said that more precisely they all had paid leave. They were shocked and looked closely at the Duchess as they were ready to serve her all their lives. The Admiral looked at Sebastian in surprise and asked if the Duchess had given him leave as a reward for his work. He said that it was very unexpected. He looked around in surprise because he saw an interesting interior. He said that for the banquet she chose not roses or lilies, but daisies. He knew that roses cannot withstand the cold. He looked at Sebastian intently and said that she was a very wise woman. Sebastian smiled and said that she was, and also asked what about the Colonel. The Admiral said that the Colonel would be outside since he said that he was not going to eat or drink at the event. New Lady Sebastian looked at the Admiral in surprise and asked if he would really be outside alone. The Admiral sighed heavily and said that it seemed so. He said that everything was very difficult after everything that had happened. A moment later, the trumpet sounded and the Admiral was dumbfounded. A few minutes later, the Duke and Duchess were announced to have arrived. The knights froze in shock as they saw that the new lady was simply beautiful. The young lady in turn noticed that Anto was not in the banquet hall. The young man was one of her best friends. She knew that after her death much had changed. She wondered what had become of him. She thought that he must be cursing the powers of day behind her death. She was puzzled because she understood why he did not show up at the banquet. The Admiral approached the Duchess and greeted her and also introduced himself. The young lady looked at him intently and greeted him with a smile. She saw that he was not hostile towards her. She knew that he, Sebastian, and the Duke had put the Empire's advantage first. He looked at her intently and said that as a wedding gift they were giving them wine. He said that it was taken from pirates. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if the pirates really had such good wine. She said that it was very strange. The Admiral looked at her closely and asked if she would like to try some wine. The young lady smiled and said that she would like to try a little. A moment later, she froze in place in shock as her heart suddenly started pounding. She was confused as she felt unbearable pain. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she was okay. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was fine. She was in shock as she realized that her body was burning from her fingertips. She was confused and did not understand what was happening to her. A moment later, the Duke picked her up in his arms. The young lady was in shock and screamed. He looked at her closely and said that it seemed that she was having a nervous breakdown again. She sighed heavily and said that it was not so, but a moment later her head began to hurt very badly and she screamed. The Duke looked at her in bewilderment and surprise and called out. A moment later she heard someone screaming. She heard that they were being attacked. She was in shock as she realized that there was a man sitting in the oak barrel. The young lady in turn was puzzled. She did not understand where she was and what kind of place it was. She did not understand why she was running blindfolded. A moment later, she saw the barrels that had been taken away by the Northern Fleet. She realized that there was a man hiding there. The young lady realized that he had crawled out of the barrel that had been brought to the wine cellar of the mansion. She was shocked when she saw him grab Charlotte by the hair. She realized that he had stolen her. The little girl was writhing and screaming as she was very scared, and the Duchess in turn understood that she needed to quickly save Charlotte. With lightning speed, she untied her eyes. The Duchess understood that she must do everything possible to ensure that the child was safe and sound. The man looked at the new Duchess in surprise and said that if she came to them, he would let the girl go. The young lady in turn knew that she would not allow him to hurt Charlotte. She looked at him intently and, agreeing, said that she was going to him and he must let the girl go. She was very scared as she did not know what would happen if he caught them both. A moment later, the man tugged the Duchess's hand with a smirk on his face. The Duchess sighed heavily as she was glad he let go of the girl. But she froze when she saw the blood, and a moment later a scream rang out in the hall. The young lady was puzzled. She did not understand whether she saw the future or it was just a dream. She knew she was about to see the corridor leading to Charlotte's room. She was confused because she had a blindfold on her eyes. It seemed to her that she was returning to the beginning of the dream. She knew that whether it was a mirage or the future, she knew it was a good opportunity. She really wished she could turn back time. She wanted to see the future. She wanted the girl to stay safe. A moment later, she looked at the man in shock. She froze in place, looking at the man as she found the only way to save Charlotte. A moment later, she woke up from a terrible dream. The maid looked at her mistress in surprise. The maid looked at her mistress with concern and said that there was a commotion outside the young lady, in turn wondered if she had returned to reality. The maid looked at her mistress with alarm and asked where she was going since it was very dangerous outside. The young lady in turn understood that she needed to save Charlotte, who would soon be there. The Duchess looked closely at Sonia and told her to stay in the room. A moment later, the young lady descended into the hall where a lively banquet had been taking place a few minutes earlier. The Admiral froze in place because when he saw the Duchess, he was puzzled and did not understand what she was doing there. He shouted to the knights that he would stop everyone and they should run after the lady. The Duchess in turn knew that they had to run after her because she needed them so that she could stop the man and save Charlotte. A moment later, she ran to the scene and shouted at the man to stop. The man looked at those present with anger and told them to immediately move towards me because if they came closer, he would kill the girl. The knights were shocked and did not understand how the pirates ended up on the second floor. The Duchess knew that in her dream she had used different methods, but ordinary negotiations did not help save the young lady. She understood that the man, unfortunately, was not smart enough to discuss anything with him. She looked at the man intently as she knew there was only one way to solve the problem. The Duchess looked at the man with a smirk and told him to look at her necklace. She said it was very beautiful. She looked at him intently and said that she could give him all her jewelry. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was doing. He was surprised as she was going to give him the jewelry. She said with a smile that she was the Grand Duchess. Charlotte and the man froze in shock, but a moment later the man laughed hysterically. He looked at her intently and said that there were rumors that the new Duchess was simply crazy, and he thought it was true. She, in turn, understood that she had to distract him, and then Hild would have an opportunity to strike. Hild, the only one who used a bow. She saw him in a dream, and he should already be here. Fiona knew that he would be waiting with an arrow drawn behind a tree. She understood that she needed to lead the man to the window so that the archer would notice him. A moment later, the young lady sat down on the ground and, breathing heavily, said that her legs hurt and she could not walk. She sighed heavily and, with the most innocent look, said that if he wanted to take all her jewelry, he should come to her himself. The man was furious as he did not expect this. He shouted and swore nervously at the Duchess, but she in turn called him closer to her. He looked at her furiously and shouted at her to stay where she was. The lady in turn was very glad since she led the man to the very window. She hoped that the knight would shoot straight at the target. A moment later, everything happened as she planned and the arrow hit the man in the hand. He screamed in rage. The young lady was very happy as everything was happening just perfectly. She grabbed the young lady's hand with lightning speed and shouted to the knights to take the girl away. The Duchess in turn was very glad that she helped avoid trouble. She understood that in her dream, she had made a decision between a future in which she would suffer and a future in which Charlotte would die. She chose the first. The knight froze in shock, but a moment later he shouted and called out to the lady. The Duchess stood and looked intently at everyone present with an innocent smile on her face. She already knew her entire future in advance. The man slowly approached her. She knew that this was her end. The man angrily grabbed the Duchess by the hair and said that if she continued to kick, he would cut her throat. The young lady, in turn, was prepared for something like this, but she was still very scared. She called the Duke for help and hoped that he would come soon. A moment later, the Duke entered the room and shouted at the man to stop. The Duke looked at the man closely and said that the ship and his boss had been captured. The Duke said that the man should let her go but her lady, and then he would remain alive. The man looked at the Duke with fury and asked him if he really thought he would believe him. The man shouted for them to give him a boat and throw away all the weapons. He shouted that if they did not comply with all the conditions, the young lady would be left without a head. The Duke looked at the man with fury. As he was ready to tear him apart on the spot, the Duke threw away his sword and ordered his knights to step back and not to approach without his command. The knights were puzzled but still listened to the Duke. The man looked at everyone present with anger and shouted at them to all stand back, otherwise she would get hurt. The man looked at the Duke intently and told him to approach them slowly. The lady looked at her husband intently and quietly, whispered a hint to him. He looked down at her left hand in surprise and noticed that she was holding a weapon in her hand. The man looked at the Duke with fury and asked why he stood there rooted to the spot. The young lady in turn wanted him to start already. A moment later, she thrust the weapon she was holding into his neck. The man screamed in pain as he did not expect such a thing. A moment later, the young lady fell, and Christian P. caught her. He looked at the Duchess with bewilderment and asked her worriedly if she was all right. The young lady in turn knew that she had seen all this in a dream, and she had done everything exactly the same way, which meant that now everything should be fine. She was very glad that everything went according to her plan. The young lady looked in my direction in surprise and called her husband. She froze in place because she saw his angry expression. She froze in place because he was beating the man. She saw her husband like that for the first time. The knights and the Duke shouted and asked him to stop because the Duchess was fine. The young lady was shocked as she saw her husband was shaking. She wondered if he remembered Gabriella's death. She looked at her husband and said that she was hardly hurt so he could stop. She said that Charlotte was shocked by this and that she needed to go to her. The Duke looked at her with fury and asked if she now had any idea what his wife had gone through. The Duke shouted that it was careless of her and she could have died. He asked angrily if she knew what it meant. She sighed heavily and said that she knew. She was puzzled and worried as the heat was burning in her body again. She did not hear her husband's words, but she did not want to lose consciousness again. Asking for forgiveness, she said that she would be careful. Unfortunately, she could not say anything more. The Duke froze in shock and stared at his wife. She, in turn, did not want to anger him. With her last strength, she asked if he could hug her. She wanted to hold back, but unfortunately, her strength was leaving her body. She slowly closed her eyes and saw the Duke running towards her. The Duke in turn screamed, but everything was fair. Sometime later, in the underground prison of the mansion, Sebastian was conducting an interrogation. Sebastian looked at the Duke intently and said that unfortunately they were hurt, because no matter how much he tortured him, he still remained silent. He looked at the Duke intently and said that he apparently did not know who was behind it all. The Duke frowned for a moment and thought he was surprised that the pirates who had not received official recognition from Delport knew exactly the route from the wine warehouse to the inner chambers. He understood that they knew about the structure of the mansion. The Duke looked closely at our friend and threw away the documents, saying that a huge rat had settled in their mansion. The Duke understood that if it was not someone outside, then there was a possibility that it was the third prince. The Duke said that someone wanted them to think so and get rid of the third prince with their own hands. Sebastian thought for a moment and said that in that case all suspicion would fall on the first prince, since he wanted to get rid of his direct competitor. Sebastian looked at the Duke intently and asked if he was going to see the lady. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was so and he must continue to look for clues. He was puzzled because he knew that 10 years had passed since the previous infiltration of the mansion. He was puzzled and wondered if the first prince was involved. Then how did he manage to obtain all the information? He understood that their duchy was quite close-knit and did not interact much with the outside world. He knew that there was of course a chance that someone could have passed them on, but it was very small. He thought that most likely the pirate leader and the prince had made a deal. The Duke thought that perhaps the thugs had entered the estate by posing as workers, after which they stole the plans for the mansion and delivered them to the leader. And already, with this information, a deal was made with the first prince. The Duke was puzzled and alarmed, for he had the feeling that he was being led by the nose. The knight looked at the Duke intently and bowed, greeting him. The Duke looked at the knight intently and asked if his wife was awake. The knight said that she was still sleeping. The Duke sighed heavily. Looking at the door, he did not dare to enter. A moment later, he was already in and saw the maids as well as Charlotte, who was next to his wife. The Duke looked in surprise at his wife, who was sleeping peacefully on the bed. He was surprised because he saw flowers. He looked closely at the maid and asked who had presented the flowers to his wife. The maid hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She remembered the prince who came to his sister and said that she could not wake up because of this bad smell. The maid sighed heavily and said that these were the words of the third prince. The maid looked at the young lady and said that she was constantly near the Duchess. Charlotte sat next to the Duchess and, bursting into tears, said that it was all her fault since she had gone outside without permission. The maid sighed heavily and said that the young lady considered herself to be to blame. The Duke looked hard at the maid and said that he would remain in the room and that she should take Charlotte to her room. Sometime later, the Duke sat next to his wife and looked at her intently. He sighed heavily and said that he had become an idiot, twice unable to protect his wife. He said that when his first wife died, he swore that he would never love anyone else, and he didn't need anyone else. He was furious because he didn't understand how Fiona had started to attract his attention. He looked at her hard and said that he hadn't wanted to see her at all, and in turn, he had tried very hard not to worry about her. He was furious and said that she should have stayed in the East Wing in the first place. Ernst looked at her and said with regret in his voice that then she would not be lying in bed unconscious. He sighed heavily. Looking out the window, said that, as she had said earlier, it was time to clean up and he would do it. He looked at her intently and said that she could change everything the way she wanted so that there would be no traces of the past left. He looked at her intently and asked if she could wake up already. The young lady was taken aback and opened her eyes as she heard someone calling her. The young lady in turn was very much puzzled. She did not understand what was happening and where she was. The Duke looked at his wife in surprise and confusion and called her. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand why they were here as they were in the mansion. She thought for a moment as her last memory was of him running towards her now. She realized that she had passed out again. Looking back, she realized that she was seeing the future. She understood that her husband was very worried about her and she needed to wake up as soon as possible. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was holding her head again. He looked at her intently and asked if she was ill. The young lady looked at her husband closely and suddenly memories of the past came flooding back to her. She always offered him her help, but he refused. She remembered the look on his face when he said it would be easier if she wanted to have a lover. She sighed heavily as she still remembered him saying something like that. A moment later, the Duke lifted his wife up. She froze in surprise from embarrassment. He looked at her closely and said that she was very pale, but had no fever. She was amazed by such care, and she couldn't even believe that this was their future. The young lady hugged her husband tightly. She didn't want to go back to reality at all. A whole week had passed since the attack, and the Duchess had not woken up. The Duke looked closely at his wife. He was puzzled that so much time had passed and she had not yet woken up. He looked sadly at his wife holding her hand, but a moment later he heard her wake up. The Duke looked at his wife in surprise and called her. She froze as she did not expect to see him near her bed. He shouted in shock and asked if she was awake. She stared at him and wondered how long he had been there. The young lady was surprised that he was worried about her. She looked intently at her husband as he called her by name. She looked at him with a smile and said that it was the first time he called her by name, and apparently he was very happy to see her. She saw that he had changed, and his behavior had also changed. She wondered if it was all because of the lifting of restrictions. The Duchess looked at her husband intently. She wanted to say who she really was, but unfortunately she could not utter a word. The Duke looked at his wife worriedly and asked what was wrong with her. The young lady was very upset because she realized that she alone could tell who she really was. Now she realized that the limitations still remained. She wondered when they would disappear. The young lady sighed heavily as she understood that she could not do anything. She knew that their meeting after a long separation would not take place today. She looked closely at her husband and asked how Charlotte was doing. The Duchess was puzzled that the young lady had survived the attack at such a young age. He was also excited and puzzled. He thought not knowing how to answer the question. But a moment later, looking at his wife sighing heavily, he said that they would talk to her when she recovered. The young lady looked closely at her husband's expression. She did not like it, and her soul was uneasy. Unfortunately, 2 days later, her fears were justified. The Duchess looked at the maid in surprise and asked if Charlotte would not see her. The maid was a little puzzled and said that this was true. The Duchess was shocked as she did not expect to hear something like this. She did not understand why this was happening. The Duchess shouted furiously that the young lady had been with her the whole time she was unconscious. The Duchess was in shock as her lady simply refused to meet her. The Duchess looked at the maid and asked if it was all about the gnawing guilt. The maid said that everyone now knew that the Duchess tried to save the young lady and ended up being held hostage. Sonia said that everyone called the Duchess the Great Savior. The Duchess was shocked because she did not expect to hear such a thing. She was puzzled because she did everything only because she had dreams about the future. The maid told her mistress that the young lady thought she had suffered because of her, and the Duchess did not come to herself for a whole week, so Charlotte was constantly near and praying. The Duchess looked at the maid in confusion and asked who allowed her to simply take all the blame on herself and be in such a state at her bedside. Fiona was furious. She did not understand how the teacher could allow herself to do this. Fiona knew that in this world, the role of a mentor is very important. It is she who is raising the child, not the nanny. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that Charlotte would not blame herself if her governess had coped with her job. She was furious and didn't understand why everything happened this way. The Duchess was puzzled because even after several days the young lady refused to meet her. The Duchess sighed heavily. She did not understand why the young lady did not want to see her. She knew she would have found it herself if she had been feeling better, but unfortunately, from lying in bed for so long, her muscles had become weak. The Duke sat quietly next to his wife's bed and smiled. The Duchess, with the speed of lightning, the young lady sat up in bed and asked her husband in bewilderment if he had just grinned. The Duke, smiling, said that it was not so. She looked at him intently and said that she had definitely heard it. The Duke said that she had just imagined it. The young lady thought for a moment and looked closely at her husband, as she knew that last time he called her by name, and now he even smiled. This behavior made her very embarrassed. She was surprised because he started working right in her bedroom and not in his office. She looked at him intently and wondered if he was afraid that she would faint again. She said that after recovery, she would need to immediately find out what she liked about Charlotte. She said with a smile that she would like to change the teacher to several teachers of individual subjects. She knew that she could not just turn a blind eye to the behavior of the teacher. The Duke said that they would do as she wanted. The young lady was surprised and amazed because she did not think that her husband would be so understanding. She really hoped that he would soon recover and be able to walk with the young lady and eat sweets with her. A moment later, she remembered that she had bought a gift for her husband when they went out last time. She knew that now was the time to give him the gift. The young lady looked at her husband closely and asked if he could come to her. The Duke looked at her in surprise, but still agreed. She looked at him intently and, with a radiant smile, asked him to close his eyes. A moment later, she said he could open his eyes, and the Duke froze, looking at the box. The young lady presented the Duke with a costume accessory which could be attached to the collar of a naval uniform and was often given as a gift by those closest to him, such as family members or lovers. The Duke froze in place and asked, puzzled, where the gift came from. She asked with a smile if he liked the gift. The Duke was suddenly overcome with memories of how his late wife had also given him such a gift. She asked him with a radiant smile if he liked the gift. The young lady looked at her husband with puzzlement and asked if he was really feeling ill. The Duke sighed heavily and said that everything was not so, and also thanked her for the gift. She was a little puzzled because she didn't understand why he was leaving. He left, and she stood frozen in place looking after him. The young lady was excited and puzzled. She did not understand why he suddenly became so cold. She wondered if he remembered Gabriella after receiving the gift. A moment later, Sebastian entered the room and asked with a smile if he was really seeing an angel now. She looked at him in surprise. The young lady wondered why he had come to her so suddenly. She looked at him intently as she saw that he still loved desserts. She asked him with a smile if he would like to join her. He thanked her and said that he had come to ask her something. She looked at her and asked if she had dreams that showed the future. He looked at her and said that before she fainted, she said that there was a man in an oak barrel, and then she dreamed of pirates who captured Lady Charlotte. He looked at her intently and asked if it was true. She looked at him intently as if she understood that he had come to find out the truth. Sebastian said, "Madam, that he does not intend to interrogate her at all, but still her power can greatly help the duchy." He looked at her closely and asked her to tell him how exactly the dreams come to her. The young lady looked at her companion intently and said that she didn't even know. She smiled and said that she didn't think she understood her power. She said with a smile that even if she could control it, she didn't know if she had the right to use it for her own gain. Sebastian looked at the Duchess closely as he expected she was not so simple. He said with a smirk that she loved the duchy enough to bypass such doubts. She looked at him intently as she understood that he was now saying that he would use everything and everyone who could be useful to the duchy. She looked at the young man with a smile because she liked him for this reason. Looking at him, she said that unfortunately her foresight was now beyond her control. She looked intently at her companion and said, lost in thought, that she now knew one thing for sure, that if she did not want to see the future, she could immediately return to reality. She thought that maybe she got these abilities because she swallowed a family heirloom. She thought that maybe Sebastian knew something about it. She looked at him intently and asked if there were any legends about the duchy's family heirlooms. She said that she saw something about it in the library. The lady knew that the snake's name was Leviathan, the snake of the moon and the guardian of the sea with the third eye. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that perhaps her abilities were related to this. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really so interested in the legends of the estate. Sebastian said that in that case he would like to ask her one more question. He looked at her intently and asked her in all seriousness why she thought her powers of foresight could be connected with the legends of X. The young lady in turn looked at him intently and said with a smile that she didn't even know. She gave him a beaming smile and said she would like to know his opinion first. Sebastian looked at the Duchess intently and said that the legend spoke of the right or left side, the front and back. He asked if she knew what that meant. He said that it was time, and the only thing that never ages was darkness. It was because of these words that people believed that the owner of the family heirloom would never age. The first prince had been collecting sacred items from all over the country in order to ascend to the throne. She knew that if he believed that possessing the Ekes family heirloom would give him immortality, he would definitely have gotten it. He said that the glow marks the boundary between day and night, and that gaining glory leads to the throne, meaning that the person who obtains the relic will become an emperor who will unite the forces of darkness and light. The young lady now understood that the reason why the first prince had actively promoted her marriage was because he thought that by becoming a duchess, she would obtain the relic. Sebastian looked at her intently and said that it was his turn to ask. He looked at her intently and asked her to answer his question. He asked why she believed that the legends about the family heirloom were related to her abilities. She knew that ever since she started seeing the future, it seemed like the spell was weakening. She wondered if she could hint to him that she was Gabriella. She wanted to at least try to do that. She looked at him hard and said he was very suspicious. He smiled and said he was proud of his caution. She looked at him with a smile and asked him to at least this time suspect her only in a positive way. She said that in the most optimistic way, which is even hard to believe. The young man froze in surprise, but a moment later said with a smile that he would try. As he left, he said that the relic had disappeared 6 years ago, and no one could find it. He smiled and said that it was a secret to others. The young lady thought for a moment about what he said. She wondered if the relic could have just disappeared. She thought that maybe that was how the Duke had been maintaining her body all this time. She thought that perhaps by disappeared, he meant the relic from Gabriella's body. She wondered what she should do with this information. The young lady stood dumbfounded on the spot as she heard someone calling her. The prince looked at her closely and said with a smile that it seemed she had gone deaf. She sighed heavily and said that she could hear him. The young lady was confused, as several days had already passed, but she could not stop thinking about it. The prince looked at his sister and said that it was not nice of her to treat him like that, since he had sent her many get-well flowers. She sighed heavily and asked if it was really his doing. She said that she didn't have a bed but a flower meadow. Christian entered his mistress's room and said that he had come to personally deliver an invitation to tea. The Duchess was surprised since she had received the invitation from Christian's grandmother. He looked at the lady intently and said that his grandmother was very impressed when she heard her story. He said that although she belonged to the forces of the day, she had the mind of the North. He looked at the lady intently and said that his grandmother had said that she was a worthy attendee at the tea party. The young lady in turn knew that his family had the most ancient history and traditions of the middle vassal families of the duchy. They not only controlled the mood of the public, but also owned a large and rich province. She understood that even though Madame was the authority of this family, the content of the letter was very rude and arrogant. She knew that Madame simply could not help but understand this, and she specially sent the invitation to undermine her. The young lady in turn was glad since Madame remained just as correct. He looked at her intently and said that the tea party would take place in 2 weeks. He told the lady that she was not yet fully recovered. The young lady in turn knew that she was fine. She looked closely at the knight and asked how the lady was. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately age was taking its toll, and that was why she had some problems with her back. The young lady knew that even a few years ago she had health problems, and she was thinking about preparing some medicine. A moment later she froze in place as she thought about the medicine. She remembered the magician she had met while shopping with Charlotte. After this incident, she and the cook prepared him several vegetarian dishes. She understood that since she had helped him, he could repay her by finding a cure for her stenosis. She didn't think that it would be difficult for a magician. The young lady in turn wanted to write him a letter. She sighed heavily as she understood that she would finally be able to meet the Duke after settling all her affairs. The Duke stood on the terrace and gazed into the distance. A moment later, he cast all his thoughts far away as he heard someone calling him. Turning around, he saw his wife, who greeted him with a radiant smile. She handed him the basket with a smile. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really brought all the food for him. The Duchess said with a smile that it was so since he had not gone to dinner. The Duke looked at his wife and asked what he should do when a weakened man brings him dinner. Looking at his wife, he asked if her legs didn't hurt. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew that there were indeed many steps as she climbed. He approached her and, asking for forgiveness, lifted her up and sat her down. The young lady, in turn, froze in surprise. She was very embarrassed. She looked at her husband intently. The young lady, in turn, wondered if she should start a conversation. She had been trying to do this for a long time, even when she got into the princess's body. She looked at him intently and asked him to tell her about her. She wanted to learn from him about the person he could not forget. Fiona said that if she had hurt him with those words, he need not tell. He looked at her intently and said that she would not hurt him with her words, since they were friends. She looked at him intently and said that everyone was talking about the late Duchess, but she knew nothing. Ernst sighed heavily and asked her for forgiveness. He remembered telling his wife not to interfere in the affairs of the mansion. He looked at his wife intently and said that, to be honest, he would like to tell her about something else. She froze looking at him. The Duke said that as she knew the hall in the mansion was destroyed and would need to be rebuilt, He looked at her closely and said that she could change their house to her taste. A moment later, he also apologized with a smile for being too stubborn all the time. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she could forgive him. The young lady in turn froze in place as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She was shocked because he asked for forgiveness and pretended to be unhappy with his handsome face. She looked intently at her husband because she knew that after he received her gift, he had always avoided her as if she reminded him of Gabriella. That's why she made the sandwich herself today, despite the pain he was still in. He managed to apologize to her first. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she forgives him. The Duke looked at her intently and said that he would like to show her something. The Duke sighed heavily and said that they were now inside the Turtle House cave. The young lady was shocked. She wondered who could give such a scary place such a cute name. Ernst looked at her intently and said with a smile that they would now go down to the very depths, so she should hold on to him tightly. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect such a thing. She was frightened, but, a moment later opening her eyes, she looked at her husband and asked if they were really falling since she had the feeling that they were frozen in the air. He looked at her intently and said that they were just going down very slowly. He didn't know how, but the airflow from below was supporting them. She was surprised because she didn't know about such a place since her husband didn't tell her anything. She was shocked as she thought that the cave seemed to be helping its guests on purpose. A moment later, he looked at her and said that they had arrived at the place. She was amazed as she did not expect to see something like this. She looked at him intently and asked how he knew about such an amazing place. She asked if he was looking for it on purpose. The Duke looked at his wife and said that it was an accident. He said that he had learned about this cave only a few years ago, when the first spring rain came. She realized that the spring rain meant the end of a long winter, and also the time when the Duke's wife died. She looked closely at her husband, so much so that he held on as best he could, but unfortunately could not cope with grief. She wondered if after her death he himself wanted to die. The Duke sighed heavily and asked his wife if she really wanted to develop tourism here. Opening the door, he looked at her intently and asked if this would be enough to accomplish what he had planned. The young lady froze in place as she saw so much gold. She was in shock and wondered what she had just seen. She had been wondering lately where the Duke got the money for his wardrobe. She understood that with all the money a small kingdom could be created. The Duke looked closely at his wife and said that he had acquired this wealth after fighting pirate ships. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was serious about this. She did not understand why he was showing her this place. She could be a spy. He looked at her closely and said that he knew she was not a spy, and he also said that he knew she was not a fool. The young lady froze in place in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, the young lady changed her mind and said with a smile that this time she was caught. He looked at her closely and said that she had not been hiding it. The young lady was glad that he allowed himself to believe her and went for rapprochement. She knew that this was only the first step in their relationship. She looked at him with a smile and asked if they could meet again. She smiled and said that she was very glad to meet him. The Duke stood frozen in surprise, but a moment later his expression changed, and he greeted her with a smile. Coming closer to her, he took her hand and kissed it with a smile, and also said that he was charmed by her mind. The young man was puzzled and did not know what to write. He did not know how to naturally propose a meeting to her. He remembered her radiant smile. He knew it would have been delightful if she had been the one to suggest meeting first. He was a little surprised that it was a personal request from her. He stood frozen in place, wondering if he was falling in love with her. Putting the document aside, he thought he needed to check his messages first. He took out his magic ball, checking all the missed messages. A moment later, he began writing the letter again. The young man entered through the window and looked at his brother in surprise. He asked if he was really that old and had not yet learned to communicate with people. The owner of the magic tower looked intently at his brother. A moment later, he rushed to his brother and asked why he had written to him for the first time in 3 years. He sighed heavily and, looking away, said that sometimes he did not have the strength to communicate with us. Dante looked at his brother in surprise and asked if he had really become an adult. He was furious, but sighing heavily, he said that it was still enough that his brother was alive. Dante looked at his brother and said that their father had already offered a reward for his capture. A moment later, Dante saw the letter his brother was writing and froze in place. He asked his brother if he had found himself a girlfriend. He said with a smile that he had met a magnificent soul, so he was in love with her magic. Dante looked at his brother closely and asked him to tell him more, as it would be fun if they were together. He looked at his brother and said that it was personal and he was not going to show him the letter. Dante sighed heavily and said that his brother, as always, was very secretive. Dante looked at his watch and said that too much time had passed, so he had to go. He climbed onto the window and said goodbye to his brother. The young man sighed heavily, wondering if all lovers behaved like this. He was puzzled because everything made him angry and irritated. He knew that he would not fall in love. He could not allow himself to do so. Sometime later, a new rumor started in the Duchy mansion. The Duchess was furious because she received a letter, and it was addressed to the Duchess, who looked like a deer in flowers. Everyone was shocked that the Duchess received a love letter from a magician. The young lady, in turn, was very angry. She tore up each letter in a rage and wondered how many letters he had sent her. He wrote to her that he was very sorry to hear that she was so busy drinking tea that she could not find time for him. He said that yes, but the medicine could be opened by taking the bottle in the hand, pressing the lid with the thumb, and at the same time one had to pronounce his name. The young lady in turn understood that the young man had very good skills. Since he was able to make such a medicine, Fiona understood that he was very impudent, since he was able to send her such a letter. He wrote that he would like to discuss everything only at the meeting, but he could not name the reason for their future meeting. The young lady was shocked and did not understand why he was so eager to meet her. She knew that she needed to go to tea first and then decide this issue. The Duke looked intently at his wife as he stood near the carriage. He wished her a good trip. The young lady thanked him and said shyly that she would be back soon. She looked at her husband in surprise and did not understand why there was so much worry on his face. But a moment later she realized that the last time she had died in a carriage accident, she wondered if he had remembered his wife's death again. He looked at her closely and told her not to follow strangers. The young lady smiled and said that she was not a little child. The Duke said that she still looked like a child, and he was very worried. He looked at her intently and said sullenly that there were a lot of perverts around the young lady, looked at him in surprise and wondered if he had heard of the magician. A moment later, she looked at him closely and laughed. She understood that for her sake, he even played the role of a jealous husband so that everyone could see that their relationship was developing a little. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that everything would be fine and that she had seen the predictions and knew herself that she would not die. She looked at him with a smile and said with complete confidence that she would definitely not die, so he did not need to worry that something would happen to her. The Duke looked at her in surprise, but said nothing. A moment later he looked away from her and said that he understood everything. She saw that he was embarrassed and understood that it was still not worth touching on this topic yet. A moment later she saw a young lady in the distance. Charlotte looked timidly at the Duchess and greeted her. The Duchess in turn saw that the young lady was still depressed. The Duchess knew that the young lady was by her side when she had many worries. The Duke looked at the young lady and told her to get into the carriage. The Duchess in turn understood that she had an excellent chance to talk to Charlotte. She hoped that this time they would definitely get closer. Sometime later, as they rode silently in the carriage, the Duchess looked at the young lady and asked if she should tell her a secret. The Duchess looked at her closely and said with a smile that when the pirates entered the castle she already knew about it, since she can see the near future in her dreams. She said it didn't happen every night, but it was clear. Then the Duchess said she thought it was all to save her. She smiled and said that if the young lady was in danger again, she would come to save her. The young lady looked at the Duchess in surprise and with a trembling voice asked why she was so kind to her. Fiona P. came closer to the girl and said that the scarf she made her was very warm. She said that the lady kept smiling even when she had no strength. The Duchess looked at the girl with a warm smile and hugged her, saying that the most important reason was that she loved her. Fiona O. hugged the young lady and said that she was part of her family. The Duchess said that if she were to find herself in danger again instead of her, she should not worry, as she should know that everything was calculated and that there would be a rescue plan, but she would be extremely careful. The young lady in turn knew that she should not show the little girl the scar on her neck. The Duchess looked at Charlotte intently and said with a smile that she was a crybaby. The Duchess realized that she had calmed her down after all, and she felt very pleased at heart. Looking out the window, the Duchess wondered what her husband was doing now. The Duke read and studied the report on the disposal of old carriages and the use of new ones intently. He remembered how his wife, with a smile on her face, told him not to worry so much as nothing would happen to the carriage. He thought for a moment, as he did not understand how the princess could know about the death of the Duchess. Sebastian looked at the Duke in surprise. A moment later, he looked at the Duke with a puzzled expression and asked if their lady knew about the incident with the carriage. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he was not sure, but it seemed so to him. The Duke looked closely at his friend and asked if he believed that a person's soul could move into another body after death. Sebastian looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he was really saying that Lady Gabriella's soul had moved into Princess Fiona's body. The Duke looked at his friend intently and said that he thought about it for a moment. Sebastian looked at the Duke intently and said that he did not want to claim that it was completely impossible, since they unfortunately did not know everything about the world. Sebastian thought about it and asked if they should ask the magician about this issue. The Duke heard about the magician and thought he said that there was one magician in the duchy. The Duke was furious because the man was constantly flirting with his wife. Ernst was puzzled because he did not want to get involved with the man and talk about his wife. He sighed heavily, as unfortunately he could not concentrate on work at all due to his constant thoughts. He remembered how she said that she definitely would not die with the speed of lightning. He rose from his chair and said that it would be necessary to go to Belmare. Sebastian looked at the Duke in surprise. He did not understand why the Duke wanted to go so suddenly. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he didn't like it either. He knew that it was just his fears, but he wanted to be with her on the way back. He knew that he didn't love the princess, but still he treasured her and didn't want her to get hurt. The young lady screamed and called for Charlotte. She was very frightened and confused. Fiona didn't know what to do as they were about to enter the current. She looked at the young lady with concern and wondered how this had happened. They fortunately arrived safely and began drinking, but unfortunately when they were riding the boat it suddenly capsized. She was shocked because she saw that people were moving further away from them. She was very scared and wondered what if they didn't see them. The young lady cried to the Duchess with tears in her eyes that she was very scared. She hoped that someone would come to their aid. The Duchess looked closely at the girl and told her not to worry, as they would definitely be rescued. She knew that she would do everything possible to save her. The young lady saw the teacher from afar, but she had no intention of dying in such a situation. The Duchess looked at Rachel closely. She saw her evil grin. 2 hours earlier, they had arrived safely in the county. Madame looked closely at the Duchess, and with a smile on her face thanked her for such a long journey, and also greeted her. The Duchess looked closely at Madame. She saw her strict clothes not in fashion. She knew that Madame was still very reserved and economical. The Duchess, with a smile on her face, greeted Madame and said that she had heard a lot about her merits and virtues. She said with a smile that she hoped that she could learn a lot from her. The young lady knew that it would be right if she behaved nicely with Madame as if they were granddaughter and grandmother. She in turn knew that many would think that she was simply trying to raise her status in her eyes. Fiona knew perfectly well that this was not the case, for she was very glad to meet Madame again. Madame looked at the young ladies and smiled and told them to follow her. Madame smiled and said that the ships that ply the seas are their pride. She smiled and showed them the skillful boats. Charlotte was amazed by the beauty. She said with a smile that through the transparent bottom one can admire the underwater world. Madame looked at them intently and said with a smile that this was true, but unfortunately at her age this was no longer possible. Charlotte looked at Madame and asked her with a smile if she suffered from motion sickness. She introduced herself with a smile and said that she also suffered from the same affliction. Madame looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she remembered that a teacher had been sent to them from Beylan. Madame looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she must have excellent abilities since Charlotte was so well brought up. Rachel looked at Madame with an embarrassed smile and said that she was very pleased to hear about it, and also introduced herself. She came closer to Madame and said with a smile that she was very glad that she remembered her. Fiona looked at Rachel hard as she realized that she had decided to take advantage of the situation to show off. She was puzzled because she knew that she was much higher in status than everyone else, but she was so easily excluded from the conversation. She understood that the lady was still testing her. The young lady understood that there were many ways to maintain dignity without changing the topic of conversation. She looked at those present with a smile and said that their Charlotte was also well-versed in ancient languages, and all thanks to her mistress's teaching. Rachel was shocked and stood frozen in place, wondering how the Duchess knew about ancient languages. She looked at the Duchess with a smile and asked if she knew them too. The Duchess in turn looked at those present with embarrassment and said that this was indeed the case. The young lady was shocked and furious. She knew this was her chance to show off, but the Duchess had ruined it. She knew she had to get rid of the Duchess quickly and destroy her. The young lady watched the Duchess with fury as she carried on an informal conversation. Madame looked at the Duchess intently and said with a smile that she would like to talk to her. Rachel froze in place in shock and surprise, as she did not know what language they were speaking. She was shocked, as she noticed that the Duchess answered the questions easily. Rachel was confused. She didn't understand where the Duchess could have learned the ancient language. She was furious and didn't understand what was happening. Rachel knew that the Duchess had deliberately excluded her from the conversation, knowing full well that she did not know the language. She was furious because she knew that she would not be left with this either. The young lady looked at the mistress and called her. For a while, she quietly whispered something in her ear. A moment later, Madame looked at everyone present and asked everyone to go to the boats. She looked intently at the Duchess and said that the preparations for the water games were finished. Rachel looked hard at Madame and said with a smile that she was Charlotte's governess, so she would like to get into the same boat with her. Rachel looked at the Duchess and asked with a smile if she would sit with them. The Duchess, in turn, watched the lady closely. She did not understand what she had in mind. Sometime later, they were enjoying the view while swimming on the lake. Rachel looked at the Duchess with a smirk, and she knew that they were in the same boat now, but because of her, she couldn't get her thoughts together. She looked at the Duchess intently and wondered how she could take revenge on her. A moment later, she saw a whirlpool. She knew perfectly well that it would capsize such a small boat with ease. She knew perfectly well that then the Duchess would fall into the water before everyone's eyes. Rachel looked at the Duchess intently. She knew perfectly well that a princess of the day's forces should not be able to swim. She wanted to save Charlotte instead of the Duchess and take all the laurels for herself. She knew that then she would become the center, not the Duchess. The Duchess and Madame entered into a casual conversation. But a moment later, the young lady froze in place as she heard someone screaming. She turned around puzzled and saw the teacher fall. A moment later, Rachel grabbed the boat, causing it to capsize. The Duchess was stunned as she saw that Charlotte was in the water. Rachel swam up to Charlotte and asked with a grin if she was okay. Rachel looked closely at the young lady and with a smirk told her not to worry, as the teacher would definitely save her. A moment later, Rachel began to drown the young lady in the water. Rachel looked at the young lady with a smirk and told her to hold on a little longer because they would be found soon. She wanted the lady to stay in the water a little longer, and when the lady's people arrived, only she would save her. Meanwhile, the young lady was struggling in the water and was having great difficulty breathing. The Duchess looked around in surprise as she could not see where Charlotte was. She was excited and metal from side to side because she did not see her anywhere. But a moment later, she saw Rachel, who was holding the young lady in her arms. She saw that the teacher was drowning her. The Duchess rushed at full speed towards the young lady to save her as she could not allow her to drown. The Duchess, with lightning speed, grabbed the young lady by the hand and pulled her to the surface. She looked at the young lady with concern and asked if she was okay. Charlotte sighed heavily and said that she was okay. Fiona in turn understood that they needed to get out quickly before they were caught in a whirlpool. She looked around in surprise and saw a stone island. A moment later, they managed to climb onto dry land. Charlotte looked around in surprise and asked the Duchess, puzzled, where they were now. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that they were now on a stone island and fishermen rested here when it got dark. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that it seemed that fishermen had just recently been in this cave. She looked at the young lady and with a smile invited her to stay the night in the cave. Sometime later, the young lady managed to make a fire and they warmed themselves by the hearth. The Duchess thought about everything that had happened. She was furious because Rachel had done all this. The young lady looked at the Duchess intently and said in a trembling voice that it was all her fault. Charlotte said that it was because of her curse that everything happened. The Duchess looked at the girl in surprise and asked what she was talking about and who had told her such a thing. The Duchess was furious. She looked at the young lady and asked if the governess had really told her that. Charlotte said, puzzled, that her governess had said so, and her mother and father had died because of her, and Rachel had said that she should listen to her. Charlotte also said that the governess had punished her not to talk to the master, otherwise he would be cursed. The Duchess was furious because she knew that Rachel was just pretending to help Charlotte, but was actually brainwashing her using some curse as an excuse. She was furious and couldn't understand how anyone could do that to a small child. She looked intently at the young lady who was snoring quietly and peacefully. A moment later, the Duchess heard the sound of the clock and froze in place. She turned around as she felt as if the cave was calling her to go inside. She knew she should check what was inside. A moment later, she saw a wall with ancient writings. She didn't understand why the wall was in front of her. The young lady stared at the writing on the wall, but a moment later she heard someone calling her. Turning around, she saw her husband, who was terribly frightened. With lightning speed, the Duke ran to his wife. He wanted to hug her, but he stopped. The young lady looked at him in surprise. A moment later, the knights shouted to the Duke that the young lady was not outside. The Duke shouted to the knights to stop. The Duke said that if anyone decided to enter the cave, they would be severely punished. The young lady looked at her husband in bewilderment. A moment later, she froze in place as she realized that her wet clothes were see-through and her body was visible to everyone. The Duke took off his cloak and wrapped his wife in it. Fiona looked at her husband with embarrassment and asked him for forgiveness. He looked at her intently but said nothing. The Duke picked up Charlotte and said they needed to get back to the beach. The Duchess stood frozen in place, looking at her husband. She was puzzled and she was scared, but she tried to be strong for Charlotte's sake. She understood that even though they were not real spouses, she still wondered if it was necessary to hate her so much. The Duchess, in turn, understood perfectly well that there was no room for sadness now since she had a lot to do. Meanwhile, the Duke slowly carried the young lady in his arms. Rachel froze in place as she saw that the girl was alive. Rachel rushed to the Duke with lightning speed and asked with a smile on her face if Charlotte was all right. She wanted to know how the young lady was feeling. Rachel puzzledly said that she could not help Charlotte as she was a poor swimmer, but she was very glad that she was all right. She looked at the Duke with a grin and said that it was very good that the young lady was safe and sound. In fact, she was furious and did not understand how the girl could survive. Initially, she hoped to become a heroine in the eyes of others by helping Charlotte. But unfortunately, the flow of water suddenly increased, and she could barely get out alone. When the Duchess P fell for the rescue of the young lady, she decided that they would both die. She was in shock and wondered how they both managed to survive. Rachel knew that the Daylight Princess couldn't swim, but she was still confused and didn't understand how the princess was able to survive and save Charlotte. The Duchess slowly approached the teacher. She was furious and wanted to deal with her immediately. A moment later, the Duchess looked at her with fury and, raising her hand, called out. The Duchess angrily hit the governess in the face and she fell to the ground with a crash. Rachel was shocked. She looked at the Duchess with a sharp gaze and asked, puzzled, what she was doing. The Duchess looked at the young lady with fury and hatred. She did not understand how she dared to think about drowning Charlotte Fiona. With fury, delivered another slap. The Duchess looked at the young lady with contempt. She did not understand how Rachel dared to suggest to her that she was cursed and to blame for everything. The Duchess looked at Rachel and said that from now on she would have nothing to do with Charlotte. Fiona told her not to let her see her again. The Duchess, in turn, was furious. She did not understand how Rachel could work with children at all. She looked at the lady and asked how she dared to say that her parents died because of her curse. Rachel, in turn, shouted that this was not so, and it was all a lie. She shouted that Charlotte had made it all up and that she was just a liar. The Duke looked at the young lady with anger and asked what she had just said. The young lady, in turn, froze in place as she did not expect him to interfere in the conversation. He looked at her intently and said angrily that the Count and Countess had died with honor and dignity. He looked at the young lady with contempt and asked what she had said to their daughter. Rachel, in turn, screamed that she had said nothing of the sort. She shouted that she had spent a lot of time teaching the young lady. She did not understand why he did not believe her words. The Duke looked at Rachel with fury and asked if what she was saying was true. He said that she would be put on trial. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duke came closer to her and said angrily that if his wife's words were true, then she had better confess right now, or she would have to pay for daring to insult not only Charlotte, but also her parents. The Duke looked at the young lady with fury and ordered the guards to seize her. Rachel was in shock. She didn't expect this, and she screamed to be let go. She screamed that she had done nothing and did not understand at all why they were doing this to her. Fiona looked hard at the young lady but said nothing. She was puzzled because they ended up staying the night in the palace. She knew that nothing terrible would happen if they didn't return to the duchy today. The only thing she was worried about was that the Duke had left them so quickly without even saying a word before he left. She was excited and confused because she thought they had managed to get closer, but now she realized that the distance between them had only increased, and she was actually very sad about it. She was in shock because she knew that many problems lay ahead of her. She froze in place as she had completely forgotten about one important thing. She knew that she needed to deal with the problem as quickly as possible. She froze in place because she thought she knew something. She knew that the ancient stela with Korean characters, any Korean after reading about the 300 bowls of rice, will remember the folktale and the blind character from it. She wondered if there could be information hidden here about Ingrid, or if this was a way to get rid of her night sickness. Fiona knew that if she looked at Stella too closely, she might feel like she needed to turn back time and go back to a time when the disease had not existed. She was amazed and wondered if she had really solved her riddle. When she was still Gabriella and tried to find something that could replace the bright grass, she knew that the drops squeezed from it only slowed the progression of the disease, and it was impossible to restore vision after its loss. Fiona knew that if she could turn back time to the moment when there was still light in her eyes, she could fix everything. She knew that blood was the pledge of a promise, and the great Dianut had already continued on her way. If the last lines were to be believed, the expansion should be very close. Dianut was a goddess possessing the power of the night. The X's representatives of these forces should have a relic associated with her, a relic in the form of a three-headed sea serpent which the goddess loved. The young lady in turn wondered if this meant that the relic could help with the treatment of night sickness. She understood that she needed to collect her thoughts, and that was it. She no longer wanted to act stupidly like when she was Gabriella. A moment later, she froze in place as she heard Duke C asking her if she wanted a drink. She looked at him in surprise as she did not expect to see. She noticed that he was holding alcohol in his hands. She sighed heavily as she remembered telling her maid that she would like to drink something strong. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that it was very good that he came to her, as she wanted to discuss something. Some time later, they were sitting on the terrace and drinking wine. Ernst looked at his wife and said that Rachel had received 8 years in prison for putting Charlotte in danger by pretending she couldn't swim. Looking at his wife, he said that for the terrible words with which she had harassed the young girl, the term had been increased to 10 years. He said that an additional sentence would also be handed down for desecrating the memory of those who had been pouting. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a smile that it was a very fair outcome. The Duke looked at his wife intently. A moment later, he said that he had one question for her. He was puzzled and did not understand how she managed to save the young lady in such a situation. Ernst looked at her closely and said that she was able to light a fire and build a bonfire. He looked at her puzzled and asked where she learned to make a distress signal. He said that she also covered the girl to prevent hypothermia. He did not understand where she found a blanket on a deserted island. Ernst said that not only was she a great swimmer, but she was also able to save another person's life, even though she belonged to the powers of the day. He wondered if it was all because of the gift of prophecy. He remembered how she said with a smile that she would not die. He said that earlier, she herself said that she would not die, and he wondered if it was because of the gift of prophecy. He looked at his wife intently and asked if this meant that it helped her that she knew the future. The Duchess hesitated and said that she had no predictions. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she simply did not have time to hesitate in a dangerous situation, since the young lady could die. He was puzzled because he knew that his wife had done nothing wrong and she had tried her best to save the nth lady. He looked at her intently and asked if she could really die. The young lady froze in place in bewilderment. She looked intently at her husband and asked what he was talking about. The Duke, in turn, shouted angrily and asked why she was so careless. He looked at her with fury and said that he had the impression that she had already died once Fiona froze in place in shock. He looked at his wife intently, as this way of thinking was familiar to him. He knew that she was the one he always missed. Ernst looked at her intently and called out. But at the same time, he called out Gabriella's name. He looked at her intently and asked if it was possible that she was Gabriella. She looked intently at her husband and wanted to say something, but unfortunately she could not. The Duke looked closely at his wife and asked her to give an answer. He hoped that she had died and ended up in the princess's body. The young lady looked at her husband. She was trembling and tried to tell him her name. She looked at him intently, but unfortunately could not utter her name. She was shocked because she knew he finally recognized her, but she still couldn't tell him the truth. He looked at her with fury and asked why she was silent. Since there was much evidence that he was right, he shouted and begged her to answer. The young lady in turn sat and cursed the shackles that prevented her from answering his question. She was furious because she could not tell him who she really was and could not even nod. The Duke looked at the young lady with a grin but said nothing. A moment later, he stood up from his chair and asked for forgiveness. He said that she must be very tired. He said that he had shown himself in a terrible way and once again asked his wife for forgiveness. He sighed heavily and said that she reminded him of his late wife. He said with a grin that changing the body was simply impossible. He looked at her intently and said that he was going to rest. The young lady froze in place. She wanted to stop him, but she couldn't. She looked after him intently because she understood that he would no longer look for his late wife in her. She understood that he had again distanced himself from her. She understood perfectly well that he would return to her image from the past. The maid looked at her mistress and said with a smile that the mask festival was coming soon. She told her mistress with a smile that she looked absolutely gorgeous. The maid was surprised because she did not expect the Duchess to organize a festival for the common people. They were amazed that she decided to develop tourism in the duchy. The maids went to the mistress's district and praised her incessantly. The maid looked at her friend and asked if it was still so cold between the mistress and the master. The maids were a little puzzled and upset because after their mistress stopped communicating with her master, she often began to stare into space. They saw that the Duchess was puzzled and upset, but she tried not to show it. After the Duchess saved the young lady, rumors circulated among the servants that she was under the protection of the goddess, but still the maids were very worried about their mistress. Fiona looked at her maid and asked if she had written a letter to the first prince. The Duchess said that she meant the letters they exchanged from time to time. The maid sighed heavily and said that she would definitely write a letter today. The Duchess smiled and told her maid to try to do everything well. She said that she trusted her with such an important task because she saw that she was a very bright person. The Duchess looked at the maid with her smile and said that if she copes, she will give her a dress with jewelry for the mask festival. Sonia was shocked because she did not expect to hear something like that. She looked at the Duchess intently and said with a smile that she would certainly try. The young lady looked out the window and noticed that it was already summer. She sighed heavily as she could not even believe that the couple had changed. She knew that one season had changed to another since she and the Duke had stopped communicating. She wanted very much to lighten her burden, but she knew that in the body of a princess it would be very difficult for her to find someone to talk to. She knew that her two most faithful maids and one knight were next to her. She looked at the young people intently and asked if they wanted to hear something interesting. As she was very bored, she said with a smile that there was one couple who had entered into a marriage of convenience. She said with a soft smile that the husband treated his wife very well. Wherever they were, always thought about his wife and constantly brought her flowers. Looking at the man, everyone said that he was very caring. He constantly carried her in his arms and hugged her. His feelings were so sincere that he even helped her put on her shoes. He said that he wanted to know absolutely everything about her. Sonia looked closely at the Duchess. She was amazed by the story and said that the husband seemed to love his wife very much. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said that it was love. A moment later, she looked into the distance, muttering to herself, wondering why she hadn't realized it. Then Christian looked intently at the Duchess. The maid looked intently at her mistress and asked with a smile what had happened to the young people. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that her husband had lost his memory, and suddenly he became cold towards his wife, and unfortunately he was no longer so attentive to her, and the bedroom to which he sent flowers every day was no longer filled with their scent. The Duchess looked into the distance and said that initially in this couple the husband did everything for his wife, and because of the political side of the marriage the woman did not trust her husband, but in one moment everything changed. The Duchess said with a smile that the wife still had memories of the love she had received, and now she had to go herself to her husband who could not remember her. She said with a sad smile that now she understands how hard it was for her husband. The Duchess looked intently at everyone present who were impressed by her story. The maid looked at her mistress with a smile and said that she did not think that it was hard and unpleasant for her husband. She smiled and said that you need to show your love and only then will the other person understand your true feelings. She said with a smile that if she were in that man's place, she would also give herself to love with all her heart. The maid smiled and said that she thought that would be enough for her to be happy. The Duchess smiled and laughed. She told the maid that she was right. The Duchess smiled and said that she knew that it was not so bad when someone loved one. She smiled and thanked the maid and said that thanks to her she felt better. Fiona in turn understood that it was enough for her to simply love. She understood that even if he was pushing her away now, she would try to get closer to him. She sighed heavily and said that she would now go to the Duke's room. The knight looked intently at the lady and asked her to stop. He looked at the Duchess, puzzled and alarmed, and asked where she had heard the story. The Duchess looked at the knight with a smile and said that she did not remember, and she had heard this story somewhere. She looked at the knight with a smile and said that she probably experienced it herself. He froze in shock and asked if it was really her. She stood for a moment looking intently at the young knight. She came to her husband's office to discuss Stella, about whom they had not been able to talk earlier. She sighed heavily, as she didn't know that he was not there today. Sebastian looked at the Duchess and said that the gentleman was not there at the moment. He looked at her and asked if she had something urgent. She sighed heavily and, looking at Sebastian, said that she had some business with him. The Duchess looked at Sebastian intently and said that she wanted to talk about the duchy's relic. He looked at her intently and said that he had said earlier that it was missing. The Duchess looked at him intently and asked if she looked like a fool. The Duchess looked at Sebastian intently and said that after the death of the Duke's ex-wife, he himself stopped the Duke from cremating her and insisted on a funeral. He looked at her puzzled and said that this was a very interesting hypothesis. The young lady sighed heavily and told him not to worry because the prince didn't know about it. Fiona said that no one knew that before Gabriella's death, someone took her ring. Sebastian froze in place in surprise as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The young lady said that in any case the former Duchess was probably cremated. She sighed heavily and said that since the relic was a sacred thing, it could not burn or drown, and it should have been preserved intact and safe. She glanced sideways at Sebastian and asked if that was true. He looked at her with a smirk and said that he didn't even know. He looked intently at the Duchess and said that he had not lied, and that the relic had indeed disappeared. Fiona asked in surprise if this was really the case. Sebastian sighed heavily and said that the relic could have been a fake, or it could have been burned in the fire. The young lady froze in place. She wondered if the ring had been transported with her. She was in shock and wondered if she had really lost the ring. The Duchess was puzzled and did not understand how it all happened. She sighed heavily because she thought that Sebastian had lied to her because of mistrust, but apparently it really was gone. She thought for a moment and wondered if the relic was missing, what should she do with Stella? She knew that since the Duke was not there, she could talk to Sebastian. The Duchess looked at the young man closely and asked if he could give her paper and pen. She knew that she had a lot to learn about Stella. He looked at her intently and asked with a smirk why they didn't ask the magician for help. The young lady thought for a moment. She knew that she needed to ask for help from the mage who was in the duchy. She immediately thought of Urion. The young lady was shocked as she briefly remembered the love letter she had sent to Urion, and Fiona said in a puzzled tone that she still wanted to visit the hospital that specialized in treating night sickness. Sebastian looked closely at the Duchess and said with a smile that it would be nice to visit there with the gentleman. The Duchess looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect that he would offer her to visit the hospital with the Duke. She was puzzled because he was suggesting that she go with her husband to the man who had sent her a love letter. She in turn understood perfectly well that if she had received a real love letter, her husband would not have been worried about it. She understood that meeting with the magician was a great idea, but still she was more interested in his older brother. She knew that he was a genius, comparable to a god, the one who rewrote the entire history of magic, the main character of the original, and also the master of Dante's magic tower. She hoped that she could meet him. The young lady hoped that if she enlisted his help, she would be able to deal with the problem she was facing without any problems. She looked at her friend closely and said with a smile that it was a great idea and she would definitely talk to the Duke. The knight looked at the gentleman intently and asked if he had still not made peace with the Duchess. The Duke did not answer. He looked at the Duke intently and said that he himself said that he would fight normally. Sebastian watched the young men sparring intently. He sighed heavily as he was confused and wondered what he was doing here. Sebastian looked at the master intently and said that the lady had just been in his bedroom. He was puzzled and did not know what had happened between them, but he knew that they had better make peace. The knight looked at the master intently and said that even he could see that a cat had run between them. The Duke looked at his friend closely and said that it was rude to the princess. Sebastian looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke said that he saw Gabriella and the Princess Sebastian froze in place in surprise. Ernst sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he could not forget Gabriella. Ernst thought that it would be better for the Duchess to direct all her feelings to someone else. Sebastian looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked if this meant that he would never love anyone again. The Duke looked at his friend in surprise and said that he did not understand, since when he had been so protective of the princess. Sebastian looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he really didn't like it. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was not so. A moment later, he said that it was time for him to go, and they could see each other later. Sebastian in turn stared intently after the Duke. He realized that the more he talked to their mistress, the more suspicions arose. He was puzzled and did not understand how the princess knew that Madame Gabriella had swallowed the ring. He was puzzled and did not understand how she knew that Mrs. Gabriella died because of an accident. He understood that these things were known only to the family of high-ranking officials. He did not understand how the lady of the day could know about them. He understood that the princess confidently asserted that he had persuaded the Duke to bury the body of Madame Gabriella. Only, he knew the contents of the last letter written by Madame. Gabriella wrote that if she died he should promise that he would do everything to take the relic. She wrote that if her husband refused, then he, Sebastian, her friend, the one who understood her perfectly, should do everything in the name of their friendship. He knew there was only one answer to this. He couldn't believe it, but he knew that Mrs. Fiona was actually Gabriella. He was puzzled and did not understand how this was even possible, since he knew that transmigration of souls does not happen. He understood that if he imagined that it did exist, then this became the only explanation for her behavior. He saw that the current Duchess was intelligent and wise, and not the stupid lady everyone was talking about, and she had successfully managed things as if she had already been in the duchy. He was sure that Fiona was Gabriella. He knew that he couldn't just say that the rumors about the princess were fiction. Since he knew that it was impossible to lead people by the nose for so long, he assumed that the princess and the former duchess were one and the same person. He understood perfectly well that they were different people up to a certain point, but at one fine moment the duchess became a princess. He understood that if this strange assumption of hers was true, then there was no point in suspecting or being wary of the young lady. Sebastian knew perfectly well that this would be an excellent chance for them, and in this way they could easily get rid of the first prince. The Duke was a little puzzled, as he had wanted to take a short walk but had ended up staying up all night. He looked into the distance in surprise and saw an owl wearing a red scarf. He understood perfectly well that Owl had brought him an urgent letter from Gayan. The Duke in turn learned from the letter that the man who had approached the leader of the pirates was not the first prince but the second Prince Wilhelm, and unfortunately, his target was precisely the Duchess. The Duke, in turn, was furious and thought that apparently the prince really wanted to die. He thought that the prince was just an idiot. He understood that if they killed the first prince, the second prince would easily ascend to the throne, but everything changed. Because he understood perfectly well that the prince was targeting his wife. He understood that now he would have to get rid of the second prince as well. The Duke understood perfectly well that it would be a good idea to give the throne to the third prince who protected the princess. He understood that the third prince would definitely not try to harm his wife, since they had been friends since childhood. The Duke, in turn, thought to disrupt the coronation of the first prince first and raise military detachments. He understood that since the second prince had shown himself in such a way, they would have to change their plans. He understood that they would need to stir up conflict between the second and first princes. Ernst understood perfectly well that if he was involved in the struggle affected, then it would be better for him to distance himself from his wife as far as possible. He understood that if they found out that she had become an important person for him, then she could suffer because of her brothers. Ernst was worried as he knew what had happened to his late wife. He was puzzled and now understood that he should have done it right away, but he already understood that everything turned out differently in the end. He was puzzled because he realized that he had not been able to push her away completely, and unfortunately he had not been able to forget his former wife. Ernst was angry with himself because now he realized that he had simply wasted his time. He was shocked and he understood that his wife was the first in everything for him. He remembered how she, with a radiant smile, told him to sign a contract with her. She wanted to enter into a contract marriage with him. He was puzzled because he had originally entered into a contract which he had not attached any importance to, and which he had agreed to so easily. He remembered telling the young lady not to dare to mention Gabriel without reason. He remembered Gabriella telling him that she wanted to do her best as Duchess. The Duke remembered those bright days when they greeted the people of the duchy together. Then he felt respect because her words, which he trusted, turned out to be true for him. Everything was a first. He remembered how she looked at him with a smile and said that he was very kind and fair. She said that he was the protector of this land. He knew that she considered him as such, and he really tried to live up to her words. But unfortunately, after a difficult loss, the desire to become better disappeared. He became obsessed with revenge and fell into a trap in the imperial palace. Ernst Zede wondered how disgusting he was in her eyes before he was kind and fair, and now he lived only for revenge. The Duke knew that the princess had become the person he had met when he was on the very edge of the abyss. He knew that if Gabriella was the first, then the princess was another first. He saw that she was sweet, playful, and cheerful, and it was the first time he was so interested in getting to know someone since Gabriella. For this reason, he even thought that they could become good friends until he saw her wet body. In his head, he thought that he should be more careful, but his thoughts unfortunately began to float. Then he realized that they could never be friends. He was puzzled and wondered how it was possible to fall in love so quickly. He was puzzled because he realized that the princess, just like his late wife, had managed to quickly melt his icy heart. Gabriella was still in his heart. There was no place for Fiona. He was puzzled because he understood that while he was near the princess, his heart was very difficult. The Duke looked closely at his wife sleeping peacefully. He slowly approached her and wanted to wrap her in a blanket. He understood that he had made a difficult decision, but it was difficult for him to restrain himself when he saw her so defenseless. The young lady in turn woke up and saw the Duke, who wanted to cover her with a warm blanket. She looked at him in surprise and asked when he managed to come, as she had been waiting for him for a very long time, but still fell asleep. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really had something to say to him. The Duchess looked intently at her husband and said that she had a request. She asked if he could go with her to the night sickness hospital, as she wanted to check the results of the tests. He looked closely at his wife because he understood that the head of the research team was a madman who sent her love letters, but in turn he understood that if she had a loved one, she would definitely be happier than she was now. The Duke looked at his wife intently and said that unfortunately he had a lot to do, so that was unlikely. The young lady was surprised, but a moment later she said she understood him. He looked at her intently and said she would be better off that way. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke looked at his wife intently and said that for her own good she should find herself a loved one. She froze in surprise, looking at her husband. A moment later, she asked what he was talking about. Fiona looked at him in shock and asked what he had just said. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he didn't care if she had a lover. He understood that she should have more freedom. He understood perfectly well that a man who had no attachment to his ex-wife would suit her. Ernst understood that she should have a noble and unbroken young man. The Duchess froze in place from shock. She was furious, but looking at her husband, she calmly asked if he was sure that he would not regret his words. He sighed heavily and asked if there was a reason for that. Ernst looked closely at his wife and said that there were many worthy men among the soldiers. He said that if she didn't mind, he could send someone to her bedroom. The Duchess was in shock and could not utter a word. The Duke in turn understood perfectly well that he had to let the princess go. Since he could no longer see her as his late wife, he understood that he could no longer stay close to her when his whole life was tied to revenge. The young lady looked at him with fury and said that he was simply the biggest idiot in the world. He was puzzled, but he knew that it was enough. He knew that when his revenge was over, he would definitely divorce the princess. The young lady left, leaving her husband alone with himself. She knew that everything was very bad. She was puzzled and did not understand how he dared to tell her such a thing. She knew she could be angry if it was about another woman, but she knew she could only cry because it was all about her past self. She was furious because she tried to get closer to him again, but it only got worse. She was furious and simply screamed with indignation. Christian looked at the lady in surprise and called her. The young lady looked at him in surprise. The knight looked at the lady in surprise and asked why she was here. He froze in place because he saw that she was crying. A moment later, the Duchess began to cry very loudly. The young man was puzzled and did not understand the reason for her tears. He came closer to her and asked her to calm down first. He looked closely at the lady and asked if she was feeling better. He sighed heavily and said that he just didn't think the gentleman was serious in his intentions. He told the lady that the gentleman simply had a bad character. She looked at him closely and said that she knew about it, but also asked if he thought that would stop her. Christian sighed heavily and said with a relieved smile that it was just good. He looked at her intently and said that they could pretend that he had not heard anything. He said that as soon as she calmed down, she could come out. The young lady, in turn, looked at the knight intently and thanked him for his support. The maids looked at the knight in surprise and intently frozen in place. They looked at him in bewilderment as they saw him leaving the Duchess's room. The young maids froze in place as they saw their joyful mistress looking intently at the young knight. Sometime later, all the servants in the duchy gossiped that the major and the lady were lovers, but some servants claimed that this was just nonsense. The Duke sat in his office with his assistant reading reports on the work done. Sebastian read a report that there were rumors in the castle about a special relationship between the major and the lady. He was puzzled because he knew that the lady always looked for a young man when she was sad. He thought that the master had somehow upset his wife. He looked closely at the Duke, wondering how he would react to hearing this gossip. Sebastian looked closely at the Duke and said with a smile that there would be a masquerade ball very soon. He said with a smile that their mistress was so beautiful that all men's eyes would be glued to her. He said with a grin that he could already imagine how it would be. The Duke frowned for a moment but said nothing in reply to his assistant. Sebastian looked closely at the Duke and asked if they should assign Colonel Anatole to her. The Duke looked at his assistant in surprise and said that unfortunately he did not have such a high status. Sebastian said that Mr. Anato was of the same family as the lady, so he would be able to stay nearby and guard her for a whole day. Sebastian looked at the Duke intently and told him to think for himself, since the lady could be changing clothes and the murderer would enter her room. He asked the Duke what they would do then. He looked at the Duke intently and said that the princes were alarming, and they could just manipulate her and then kill her. He said that they better be prepared for that. The Duke in turn stopped but looked at his assistant. He understood that all this was for her sake. He looked closely at his friend and said that he understood him, and also it was necessary to give the order to the colonel. He understood that for the sake of her life, one could go to great lengths. The Duke looked closely at his assistant and said that they needed to find another job for her current personal knight, as they needed someone who could deliver the cargo to the capital. The Duke said that he would send evidence of the second prince's cooperation with other countries to the first prince. He said with a grin that he would send the documents revealing the first prince's corruption to the second prince, and all that would be left for them to do was wait for them to attack each other. The lady in turn slowly sipped her tea. Charlotte looked at the Duchess and said with a smile that there was a prize for the best couple at the masquerade ball. She smiled and said that awards are given to couples who are most compatible with each other. Charlotte said with a smile that Hild often won awards for best men's suit. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and asked, "What about the other men?" The young lady said with a smile that he was the coolest of them all. She said with a smile that she would not marry a man who was less handsome than him. The prince in turn sighed heavily as he was struck by her logic. The lady looked intently at the Duchess. Charlotte asked the Duchess if she was okay. As she looked very thoughtful, Charlotte said that many people were worried about the ball. The Duchess looked at the girl closely and said that it was time for her afternoon nap. The Duchess asked Charlotte if she wanted to go on holiday. Sometime later, Charlotte was sleeping quietly on the Duchess's lap. The prince looked intently at the Duchess and said that she must tell him everything already. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and asked him what he wanted to know. He said that he wanted to know the reason why she was crying. He looked at her intently and asked if it was all because of the Duke. He looked at her and said that he could be very angry with the Duke. The young lady looked at him intently and thanked him for his concern and also called him brother. The prince, looking at the Duchess, told her not to call him that. Since she was not his sister, the Duchess froze in place from shock since she did not expect to hear such a thing.